It began in darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and steals warmth. A December night in 1944, when winter wrapped its claws around the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in slow, suffocating layers, and the trees stood like silent observers, unaware they were about to become the witnesses of one of the most desperate stands of the entire war. Bastogne was not a grand city, it was a crossroads, a cluster of roads that cut through the forest like arteries. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the region. Whoever lost it surrendered the beating heart of the Ardennes. And into this crossroads marched the men of the 101st Airborne Division, exhausted, under-equipped, low on ammunition, short on winter clothing, and suddenly surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. This is the defense of Bastogne. The moment when tired soldiers dug their boots into frozen earth and refused to yield. The moment when a siege became legend. And the moment when the world learned what it meant for ordinary men to hold the line against overwhelming odds. The Germans had unleashed their last gamble, a massive winter offensive known as the Ardennes Assault. It was designed to punch through the Allied front, split the American and British forces, and seize the port of Antwerp. Hitler believed he could shock the world, reverse the collapse of the Third Reich, and force the West into negotiating peace. His armored spearheads poured through the woods, smashing through thin American lines and driving deep into Belgium. And as the German advance surged westward, Bastogne became the hinge point of everything. 7 major roads converged there. Take Bastogne, and the advance could continue. Lose it, and the offensive stalled. The crossroads meant life. The crossroads meant hope, and Hitler intended to take it. But the Allies were not blind. In trucks, on jeeps, on anything that could move across icy roads, reinforcements were rushed toward the gap. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. They had barely recovered from the nightmares of Normandy. They had jumped over Holland just weeks prior, fighting at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. Their boots were worn, their uniforms were thin, some had no gloves, others had no winter jackets. But when the call came, they moved without hesitation. They reached Bastogne just as the German ring began to close. Once inside the town, the roads behind them collapsed, surrounded, cut off, trapped. Artillery shells rained down day and night, turning buildings into splinters and bodies into frozen shapes. Beneath white blankets of snow, medical supplies ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded men lay in basements without morphine. Paratroopers hacked at frozen ground to dig foxholes, their fingers bleeding through thin gloves. They wrapped burlap sacks around their boots to keep their toes from turning black. Every breath turned to ice. Every night the forest groaned under the weight of the cold. Yet there was something unbreakable inside those men, something that would not bend. Hold fast, their officers said. No retreat, no surrender. Then came the message from outside the siege. The German commander sent an ultimatum: surrender or be destroyed. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, received the letter. He looked at it, he laughed, and he gave his reply. Nuts! That single word rippled through the frozen foxholes, through the command posts, through the stunned German lines. It was not strategy. It was not bravado. It was defiance. The defense of Bastogne became more than a military operation. It became a symbol of the American refusal to break. Days passed. The siege tightened. Weather grounded Allied aircraft. Frostbite spread. The wounded filled cellars. Soldiers slept with their weapons against their chests, so the metal wouldn't freeze. And the Germans kept coming, probing attacks, tank assaults, infantry charges through snow that swallowed their boots. Yet the 101st held. And then, on Christmas Eve, a distant rumble echoed through the forest. Engines. Many engines. The sound rolled like thunder. It grew louder, closer, undeniable. American tanks burst through the German line, led by George Patton's Third Army, racing north in a maneuver so fast that even his own staff doubted it could be done. They broke through. They reached Bastogne. The siege was lifted. But what mattered most was not that help arrived. It was that Bastogne never fell. The German offensive collapsed soon after. The Battle of the Bulge became the last gasp of Hitler's strategy, and Bastogne became the turning point, the place where a surrounded division held the crossroads and held back an empire. Today, if you walk through the Ardennes in winter, the forest seems calm, snow rests on the branches, smoke no longer rises from gun barrels, but the earth remembers. Under the frozen soil lie foxholes still visible after 80 years. Under that snow once stood men whose bodies shook with cold and fear, but whose spirits held firm. They stood not because they were invincible, but because someone needed to stand. The world calls it courage. They simply called it duty. Tonight we return to that frozen crossroads, to the starving medics working by candlelight, to the frostbitten paratroopers staring into the woods, to the moment when a single word, nuts, defined an entire division's legacy. This is the defense of Bastogne, the siege, the sacrifice, and the unshakable will of the surrounded. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere warm and safe? Or can you almost feel the winter wind of Bastogne brushing against your skin as history breathes again? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. December 18th, 1944, 8:30 in the evening, inside a makeshift movie theatre at Camp Mourmelon, France. Soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division watched Bing Crosby croon across a flickering screen. They had earned this moment, 58 days of continuous combat in Holland, finally behind them. Some men slouched in their seats, half asleep. Others wrote letters home, their minds already drifting toward the hot showers and clean bunks waiting outside. Then the lights snapped on. Officers rushed down the aisles, shouting names, pulling men from their seats. No explanations, just urgency encoded in every syllable. Within minutes, the theatre emptied like water through a drain. Across camp the pattern repeated, soldiers yanked from bars, mid-drink, from showers with soap still in their hair, from the first real sleep they'd had in weeks. Something massive was happening, something that couldn't wait until morning. The orders arrived in fragments, passed from commander to company to platoon in a cascading wave of controlled chaos. The German army had launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest. American lines were collapsing. A critical road junction in Belgium needed immediate reinforcement. The town's name meant nothing to most of these men. Bastogne. They had 2 hours to pack everything they'd need to fight a winter campaign. Most of their winter equipment was still in depot, scheduled for delivery next week. By 2 in the morning on December 19th, a convoy of trucks crawled through darkness on icy French roads. 11,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division, minus 1 regiment left behind, heading toward a crisis they didn't yet understand. Corporal Donald Baguette sat in the back of a deuce and a half, watching his breath crystallize in the frigid air. He wore the same summer weight uniform he'd jumped into Holland with, now threadbare and patched. Around him, men tried to sleep sitting up, weapons clutched between their knees. Nobody spoke much. They'd learned in Normandy and Holland that speculation was pointless. Reality always exceeded imagination. The convoy passed refugees moving in the opposite direction. Belgian families, their possessions piled onto carts and wagons, fleeing south with the desperate energy of people who knew what German occupation meant. Old men and women, children wrapped in blankets, all moving through the December cold with the single-minded focus of survival. Some shouted warnings at the American trucks. "The Germans are everywhere. Turn back." The soldiers looked at each other in the darkness. If civilians were running this hard, what exactly were they driving toward? Dawn broke grey and bitter on December 19th. From the truck beds, the paratroopers caught their first glimpse of Bastogne. The town sat in a shallow bowl of rolling farmland, medieval church spires rising above stone buildings that had stood for centuries. 7 roads radiated from the town centre like spokes on a wheel, connecting Bastogne to every major city and supply route in the region. It was this geometry that made the town strategically vital. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire Ardennes. The Germans needed these roads to reach the Meuse River and drive on to Antwerp. The Americans needed them to funnel reinforcements and supplies to the crumbling front. At 1400 hours, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, met with Major General Troy Middleton at 8th Corps headquarters in the Hotel Le Brun. Middleton's face told the story before his words did. His corps had been shattered by the German offensive. 2 infantry divisions, the 106th and 28th, were fighting for survival against 7 German divisions pushing west. Armor was breaking through in multiple locations. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. Middleton's orders were simple and terrifying. Hold Bastogne. Not defend temporarily. Not delay the enemy. Hold. McAuliffe asked the obvious question. For how long? Middleton couldn't answer. Relief forces were being assembled, but when they'd arrive was anyone's guess. Days, maybe a week. The general's voice carried the weight of a man who had just handed out a death sentence and knew it. McAuliffe walked back to his temporary command post with the kind of clarity that comes when all options except one are stripped away. The 101st Airborne had arrived just in time. By evening on December 19th, German forces were already probing the eastern approaches to Bastogne. The original defenders, scattered remnants of armoured and engineer units, were barely holding together. Into this chaos came not just the paratroopers, but 3 combat commands from the 10th Armoured Division, Team Cherry, Team O'Hara, and Team Desabry. Each team consisted of a company of Sherman tanks, a company of armoured infantry, and supporting artillery. These teams would buy the airborne troops precious hours to establish defensive positions. But the math was brutal, and everyone knew it. Approximately 18,000 American soldiers, many without proper winter gear, were being asked to defend a 16-square-mile perimeter against an estimated 2 to 3 German divisions. The actual German strength was higher. 7 divisions were converging on Bastogne, but American intelligence didn't know that yet. Even the lower estimate suggested a defensive mission that defied conventional military wisdom. Airborne troops were trained for offensive operations, for seizing objectives and holding them until relieved. They weren't heavy infantry with the weapons and equipment for sustained defensive warfare. The ammunition situation was even more troubling. The 101st had left Camp Moormelon in such haste that supply officers hadn't been able to coordinate proper logistics. Artillery units arrived with their guns, but only 40% of their normal ammunition load. The 10th Armoured teams were already low on shells after days of fighting withdrawal. Every rifleman carried what he had in his bandolier and maybe one extra clip. There were no ammunition dumps, no reserve supplies stacked and waiting. Everything they'd need to fight would have to come up the road from the south, assuming those roads stayed open. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Coles, the division supply officer, spent December 19th conducting a grim inventory. He walked through the makeshift supply points scattered around Bastogne, counting crates and calculating burn rates. For artillery, at current defensive rates, they had perhaps 2 days of ammunition, for small arms maybe 3, if soldiers were disciplined about their shooting. Medical supplies were adequate for routine casualties, but nowhere near sufficient if the fighting turned severe. Food was the least of his worries. K rations could be stretched, soldiers could be hungry, but you couldn't fight without bullets. As darkness fell on December 19th, soldiers dug into frozen Belgian earth around Bastogne's perimeter. The ground resisted them, hard as concrete after days of freezing temperatures. Men swung pickaxes until their shoulders burned, then scraped out shallow fighting positions that offered minimal protection. Some found cellars in abandoned farmhouses and converted them into strong points. Others rigged blankets and tarps over their foxholes, creating tiny caves against the wind. The temperature hovered around 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Without proper winter gear, men wore everything they had: 2 pairs of socks, extra shirts under their jackets, scarves improvised from whatever fabric they could find. The intelligence picture remained maddeningly incomplete. 8th Corps staff officers shared what they knew, which wasn't much. The German offensive had achieved complete tactical surprise. Entire American divisions had been overrun or were retreating in disorder. The enemy was moving fast, exploiting every gap, pushing toward objectives that remained unclear. Were they trying to recapture Antwerp, split the Allied armies, force a negotiated peace? Nobody knew. What was clear was that Bastogne sat directly in the path of the German advance, and whoever held the town would control the tempo of the entire battle. General McAuliffe established his command post in the Heinz Barracks, a Belgian army facility in Bastogne. His staff set up operations in rooms that still smelled of the soldiers who'd occupied them weeks before. Maps went up on walls. Radio equipment crackled to life. Messengers began running between the command post and unit headquarters scattered around the perimeter. McAuliffe's command style was direct and unadorned. He didn't waste time on inspiring speeches or dramatic gestures. His orders were clear: establish a defensive perimeter, dig in deep, prepare for sustained combat, make every round count. By midnight on December 19th, the 101st Airborne Division was as ready as it was going to be. The perimeter was established, though it remained dangerously thin in places, sometimes just a single company covering a mile of front. Observation posts were set up in church towers and farmhouse attics, giving defenders eyes on the approaches. Artillery batteries positioned their guns in the center of the perimeter, ready to fire in any direction. Tank destroyers from the 7th and 5th Tank Destroyer Battalion took up positions at critical road junctions, their long-barreled guns covering the most likely German approach routes. What nobody could know, as they settled into their positions that first night, was that they were about to become part of something larger than a tactical battle. Bastogne would transform from a minor Belgian market town into a symbol of American resilience, of the airborne mystique, of what ordinary soldiers could accomplish under impossible circumstances. But that transformation would require 8 days of cold, hunger, fear, and violence. 8 days when survival itself was uncertain. 8 days that would start in just a few hours, when German armor came rolling out of the fog toward positions held by men who'd barely had time to dig their foxholes. The American soldiers didn't know any of this, as they tried to sleep that first night. They only knew they were in Bastogne, wherever that was, and they'd been told to hold it. How hard could it be? December 19th, 2200 hours. Lieutenant Colonel James O'Hara's radio crackled with a voice tight with controlled panic. Team Cherry, positioned east of Bastogne near the village of Longvilly, was under attack. Not probing fire, not reconnaissance, a full assault with armor and infantry. O'Hara listened as the reports deteriorated from bad to catastrophic in the span of minutes. German tanks were everywhere. The roadblock was being overrun. Units were cut off, surrounded, destroyed piecemeal in the darkness. Team Cherry had been sent forward as a tripwire, a speed bump to buy time for the airborne troops to dig in around Bastogne proper. They'd taken up positions along the road from Longvilly, setting up a hasty defense with their tanks and tank destroyers. It should have been sufficient to delay any German probe. But what hit them wasn't a probe. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Division, supported by infantry, slammed into Team Cherry's positions with overwhelming force. The Americans fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. By midnight, Team Cherry had effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Over 500 men were killed, wounded, or captured. More than 30 tanks and tank destroyers were destroyed or abandoned. The disaster at Longvilly sent shockwaves through the American command. If the Germans could destroy an armored combat team that quickly, what would they do to lightly armed paratroopers? The answer started becoming clear just hours later. At 05:30 on December 20th, Major William de Saubry's force at Neuville, a village 4 miles north of Bastogne, heard engines in the fog. Lots of engines. German armor was coming. Neuville sat on high ground dominating the approaches from the north. De Saubry's team de Saubry, a company of Shermans from the 20th Tank Battalion, a company of armored infantry, and some attached tank destroyers had moved into the village the previous evening. They'd set up a perimeter defense, positioning their tanks to cover the roads and placing infantry in the stone buildings. When dawn came on December 20th, it came wrapped in thick fog that reduced visibility to 50 yards. You could hear the German tanks before you could see them, the distinctive squeal of tank treads, the rumble of diesel engines coming closer. The fog was both blessing and curse. It concealed the German positions, but it also meant their armor couldn't maneuver effectively. When the Panzers emerged from the mist, they were already too close for long-range gunnery. The battle for Neuville became a close-quarters brawl, tanks dueling at ranges where you could see the rivets on your enemy's hull. De Saubry's Shermans had the advantage of prepared positions and good fields of fire. The Germans had numbers and heavier armor. Panzer Mark IVs and Panthers pushed into Neuville from multiple directions. Sergeant Herbert Fertel, commanding a Sherman at the northern edge of the village, watched a German tank materialize from the fog at perhaps 75 yards. He fired without conscious thought, muscle memory from months of training taking over. The 75mm shell punched through the Panzer's front armor. The German tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. But behind it came another tank, and another. Fertel's crew reloaded and fired, their ears ringing from the concussion inside the Sherman's steel hull. Around them, Neuville dissolved into chaos, the crack of tank guns, the rattle of machine guns, the screaming of wounded men, all of it wrapped in fog that turned every engagement into a point-blank surprise. The battle raged through the morning. American tank destroyers, with their long-barreled 76mm guns, proved particularly effective. They knocked out German tanks from concealed positions, then displaced before return fire could find them. But the Germans kept coming. By noon, de Sobry had lost 11 Shermans and 13 tank destroyers. The Germans had lost more, over 20 tanks destroyed, but they could afford the exchange rate. De Sobry radioed back to McAuliffe with a stark assessment. Neuville was holding, but barely. He needed reinforcements or permission to withdraw. South of Bastogne, another crisis was developing. The village of Woerden, held by a battalion of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, came under heavy attack. German infantry from the 5th Parachute Division, supported by assault guns, pushed into the village. What followed was the kind of fighting that paratroopers trained for, but never got comfortable with house to house, room to room, sometimes hand to hand in the confined spaces of Belgian farmhouses. Private First Class John Faig, part of 3rd Battalion, 501st PIR, found himself defending a stone house on Woerden's eastern edge. German infantry were working their way through the village, using buildings for cover, tossing grenades through windows. Faig and 5 other men held the house for 3 hours, firing through windows and doors, throwing back German grenades before they could explode. The house filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. Wounded men kept fighting because there was nowhere to evacuate to and no time to stop. The Americans at Woerden were outnumbered roughly 3 to 1, 600 paratroopers against an estimated 2,000 German infantry with armor support. The math was simple and brutal. By mid-afternoon, the 501st Battalion commander made the agonizing decision to withdraw. The paratroopers pulled back toward Bastogne, fighting a rearguard action that cost them heavily. Woerden was lost, but the battalion remained intact, blooded but still capable of fighting. They'd bought time, which was the only currency that mattered. Back in Bastogne, General McAuliffe was receiving reports from all sectors of the perimeter. Neuville under heavy attack, Woerden lost, Team Cherry destroyed. German forces probing everywhere, looking for weak points. His staff crowded around the operations map, marking enemy positions with red symbols that seemed to multiply by the hour. The perimeter was holding, but barely. Already on just the first day of sustained combat, the defensive plan was showing strain. The ammunition situation was becoming critical faster than anyone had anticipated. Artillery units had fired over 4,000 rounds supporting the defense of Neuville and Woerden. That represented nearly half their available ammunition. At this rate, the guns would be silent within 2 days. McAuliffe issued strict orders: artillery would only fire in support of defensive operations, no harassing fire, no interdiction missions, nothing that didn't directly support infantry in contact with the enemy. Every shell had to count. The medical situation was equally troubling. The Bastogne Seminary had been converted into a makeshift aid station, and by evening on December 20th it was already overwhelmed. Wounded men lay on the floor shoulder to shoulder, burns from tank fires, shrapnel wounds, frostbite, bullet wounds. Surgeons operated by candlelight because electric power was unreliable. They had morphine for perhaps 2 more days. Plasma supplies were even lower. Major John Pryor, the division surgeon, moved between operating tables, trying to triage who could be saved, who could wait, who was beyond help. It was the kind of medicine that required becoming someone different from the person you'd trained to be. As darkness fell on December 20th, the American commanders faced a fundamental decision. Neuville was too exposed, too far from the main perimeter to be properly supported. Woerden was already lost. Other forward positions were similarly vulnerable. The original defensive perimeter, sketched hastily on maps just 24 hours earlier, was proving unsustainable. They needed to contract the line, pull back to positions closer to Bastogne that could be more effectively defended. It meant surrendering ground, which felt like defeat, but holding exposed positions until they were overrun would mean surrendering soldiers. McAuliffe made the call. Noville would be evacuated. Other forward positions would pull back to a tighter perimeter. The new defensive line would be roughly 6 miles in circumference, close enough to Bastogne that artillery could support any sector from central positions. Close enough that units could reinforce each other. Close enough, hopefully, to hold. The order went out after midnight. Begin withdrawal at first light, fight your way back if necessary, but get back to the main perimeter. The night of December 20th to 21st was when many soldiers fully grasped what they were facing. The German offensive wasn't a local attack. It was massive, coordinated, and aimed at objectives far beyond Bastogne. Radio intercepts picked up German commanders coordinating movements of entire divisions. Reconnaissance reports spoke of German columns stretching miles back into the fog. The Americans at Bastogne weren't facing a few units that had broken through the lines. They were facing a substantial portion of 2 German armies, and those armies were trying to finish what they'd started, destroy the Allied forces in the west, and force a negotiated peace. Lieutenant Dick Winters, executive officer of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, spent that night moving between his platoons. He'd fought at Normandy, at Market Garden, survived firefights that should have killed him. But this felt different. In Normandy, they'd been attacking. In Holland, they'd been advancing. Here they were stationary, waiting for the enemy to come to them, outnumbered and undersupplied. Winters moved through the darkness, checking on his men, making sure they had ammunition, and knew their fields of fire. He didn't need to give speeches. These were veterans. They understood the situation without having it explained. What Winters saw in his soldiers' faces was something unexpected, not fear, but a kind of grim determination. They'd been told to hold Bastogne, so they'd hold Bastogne. The logic was that simple. The airborne mystique wasn't about superhuman courage or special abilities. It was about collective identity, forged through shared hardship. Paratroopers didn't surrender. They didn't retreat unless ordered. They held their positions because that's what paratroopers did. The myth they'd created about themselves had become a cage they couldn't escape, but also a source of strength that conventional units didn't possess. The Germans, attacking Bastogne from multiple directions on December 20th, had expected to roll over demoralized, retreating remnants of broken units. Instead, they'd run into organized resistance from troops who fired back with accuracy and discipline. They'd lost tanks to well-sighted tank destroyers. They'd lost infantry to paratroopers who knew how to defend buildings and wouldn't abandon positions, even when flanked. It wasn't enough to stop the German advance entirely, but it was enough to slow it, to make every yard of ground costly. And time, hours, days, was what mattered. Every hour the Germans spent fighting for Bastogne was an hour they weren't spending reaching the Meuse River. As dawn approached on December 21st, the soldiers at Bastogne prepared for the day's fighting. They cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, ate cold K-rations, because cooking fires would draw artillery. Some men tried to sleep, knowing that exhaustion would kill them as surely as German bullets. Others just waited, watching the fog, listening for the sound of engines that would signal the next attack. They'd survived the first test. The question now was whether they could survive what came next. December 21st, 0800 hours. Captain James Parker watched through binoculars as the last hope of relief burned on the road south of Bastogne. A supply convoy, 40 trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies from divisional rear areas, had attempted to reach the town through the village of Sibret. German forces had ambushed the convoy at dawn. Now the road was littered with burning vehicles, their cargo erupting in secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off. Parker lowered his binoculars, the implications settling over him like a physical weight. No more supplies were coming. Whatever the garrison had was all they'd get. The encirclement was complete. German forces had closed the ring around Bastogne during the night of December 20th to 21st. 7th Army units from the south had linked up with 5th Panzer Army units from the east. American troops inside the pocket could see German positions on all sides now, armor and infantry dug into tree lines, artillery pieces being positioned on the surrounding hills. Radio contact with 8th Corps headquarters confirmed what everyone already knew: Bastogne was cut off. The message from General Middleton was brief and brutally honest: "You're on your own." Lieutenant Colonel Carl Coles, the division supply officer, was conducting his own grim inventory that morning. He'd spent the night moving between supply dumps and artillery positions, counting shells and bullets with the precision of an accountant preparing for bankruptcy. The numbers told a story of coming disaster. Artillery ammunition, approximately 200 rounds per gun remaining. At current defensive rates, that meant less than 2 days of fire support. Small arms ammunition was at 30% capacity. Mortar rounds were nearly exhausted. Anti-tank mines, critical for stopping German armor, were already gone, used up creating the roadblocks that had failed to hold. Medical supplies were approaching crisis level even faster. Major John Pryor, examining the inventory at the Seminary Aid Station, calculated that morphine would run out within 48 hours. Plasma supplies, essential for treating shock from severe wounds, would last perhaps 3 days. Surgical supplies were being reused because there were no replacements. Bandages were washed and reused. Instruments were sterilized and used again immediately. Pryor and his surgeons were performing battlefield medicine from a previous century, all their modern training rendered irrelevant by the absence of basic supplies. The food situation was marginally better, but only marginally. Each soldier carried several K rations, and there were stockpiles in Bastogne sufficient for perhaps 4 days if carefully rationed. But carefully rationed meant hungry soldiers, and hungry soldiers made mistakes. They moved slower, fought less clearly, became more susceptible to the cold. The temperature was dropping, forecasts called for temperatures in the teens, and cold required calories to survive. Men were already wearing every piece of clothing they possessed, and still shivering in their foxholes. Inside the Bastogne perimeter were approximately 18,000 American soldiers. That number included not just the 11,000 men of the 101st Airborne Division, but thousands more, remnants of armored units, combat engineers, artillery battalions, support troops, stragglers from units destroyed during the German offensive. Every able-bodied man had been pressed into the defensive line. Clerks became riflemen, drivers became infantry, the quartermaster troops, the mechanics, the cooks, everyone who could hold a weapon was assigned a sector to defend. What made the supply crisis even more acute was the presence of approximately 2,000 Belgian civilians trapped inside the perimeter. Families who hadn't evacuated when they had the chance, elderly people who couldn't travel, children too young to understand what was happening. They competed with soldiers for shelter, for food, for the limited medical care available. Pryor's surgeons found themselves treating civilian casualties alongside military ones: a woman hit by shell fragments, a child with frostbite, old men with stress-induced heart problems. The humanitarian obligation to care for these people conflicted with the military necessity of conserving resources for combat troops. McAuliffe's staff worked through the afternoon of December 21st calculating consumption rates and trying to stretch every resource. If they reduced artillery fire by 75%, ammunition might last 5 days. If they limited small arms fire to defensive engagements only, they could extend small arms ammunition perhaps a week. Medical supplies were harder to stretch. You either had morphine or you didn't. You either had plasma or you watched men die from shock. The calculations were exercises in managed desperation, trying to find the equilibrium between fighting effectively and making supplies last until relief arrived. But when would relief arrive? Radio contact with 8th Corps provided no concrete timeline. General Middleton spoke in vague terms about relief operations being organized, about armor being moved into position, about infantry divisions being redeployed. Days, he said. Perhaps a week, maybe longer, depending on how the broader battle developed. Nobody said what everyone was thinking. Bastogne might be relieved, or it might be written off as an acceptable loss in the larger scheme of the war. 18,000 men against 7 German divisions. The math didn't favor the defenders. That evening, McAuliffe gathered his commanders for a meeting at the Heinz barracks. The mood was tense but controlled. These were professional officers who understood their situation without needing it sugar-coated. McAuliffe laid out the reality. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, food was limited, they were completely surrounded, and relief was uncertain. Then he gave his orders. Every unit would implement strict fire discipline, no shooting without a clear target and a clear threat. Artillery would fire only in direct support of infantry under attack. Everyone would go on half rations immediately. Medical personnel would prioritize combat-effective soldiers, men who could return to fighting, over those with wounds that removed them from combat permanently. The orders were harsh, the kind of decisions that peacetime officers never imagined making. But Bastogne wasn't a peacetime situation. It was a siege, and siege warfare had its own brutal logic. You conserved what you had because there was no resupply. You made choices about who lived and who died because resources were finite. You transformed soldiers into something harder than they'd been before because softness meant death for everyone. The perimeter contracted further that night. Units pulled back from the most exposed positions, tightening the defensive ring to a circumference of roughly 6 miles. This created better defensive density, fewer gaps, more interlocking fields of fire, the ability to move reserves quickly to threatened sectors. But it also meant less early warning, less space to trade for time if the Germans broke through. Every square mile of ground inside the perimeter now mattered absolutely. There was no depth, no fallback positions. If the perimeter broke, Bastogne fell. Soldiers dug deeper into the frozen ground, creating fighting positions that might keep them alive. They scrounged materials from abandoned buildings. Doors became overhead cover for foxholes, furniture became firewood, curtains became camouflage. Every building in Bastogne was ransacked for anything useful. Civilians watched American soldiers tear apart their homes and said nothing, understanding that survival justified any sacrifice. Some Belgians helped, showing soldiers the best sellers for command posts, pointing out wells that hadn't frozen, sharing what little food they had. The night of December 21st was the first time many soldiers fully confronted their mortality. The initial chaos of deployment, the rush of combat, the adrenaline of the first attacks, all of that had kept fear at bay. But now, sitting in a frozen foxhole, surrounded by enemies, low on ammunition, no relief in sight, there was time to think. Time to calculate the odds. Time to write letters home that might be final letters. Time to make peace with whatever God you believed in, or didn't. Private First Class Kurt Gabel, 5th 101st Parachute Infantry Regiment, spent that night in a foxhole near Foy with 3 other men. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They shared a cigarette, taking turns drawing on it to preserve tobacco. They cleaned their rifles, checking the actions in the darkness by feel. They listened to German tanks, repositioning in the distance, the sound of engines and track squeals marking the enemy's preparations for the next attack. Gabel had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He'd survived Market Garden. He'd figured he was living on borrowed time anyway. But this felt different. This felt like the time was running out. The Germans, looking at Bastogne from their positions around the perimeter, saw an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity: an entire American division trapped, surrounded, cut off from supply. One more push, one coordinated assault, and they could eliminate a significant threat to their flank and capture a critical road junction. The problem: the Americans weren't acting like trapped troops. They weren't surrendering. They weren't showing signs of collapse. Every probe met organized resistance. Every attack was countered with accurate artillery fire, despite the Americans' supposed ammunition shortage. The garrison at Bastogne was wounded, but still dangerous. German commanders debated their options. Some argued for continuing west, leaving a blocking force around Bastogne, while the main armor pushed toward the Meuse. Others insisted Bastogne had to be reduced. You couldn't advance with a strong point threatening your supply lines. The debate consumed hours while German soldiers waited for orders, burning fuel and losing the momentum that made the initial offensive so successful. Bastogne was doing its job even without attacking anyone. Just by existing, by refusing to fall, it was slowing the German timetable. As December 22nd dawned cold and grey, the soldiers at Bastogne prepared for another day of siege. They'd survived 3 days surrounded. How many more days could they survive? The question had no answer, only a determination to find out. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were rationed. Food was rationed. Hope somehow wasn't. The paratroopers looked at each other across their frozen foxholes and saw the same thing: we're still here, we're still fighting, and we're not finished yet. The noose had tightened, but it hadn't strangled them. Not yet. December 20th, 1944, German 47th Panzer Corps headquarters, 12 miles east of Bastogne. General Heinrich von Lettwitz stood over a map table, his finger tracing the roads that converged on a single point, Bastogne. Around him, his staff officers waited in tense silence. They'd received aerial reconnaissance reports throughout the day. American positions were stronger than anticipated. The town was being rapidly fortified, and instead of scattered remnants, they faced an organized defense. Von Lettwitz's finger stopped on Bastogne and pressed down hard, as if physical pressure could solve the problem the map represented. The dilemma was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its implications. The entire German offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, depended on speed. The plan called for armoured spearheads to reach the Meuse River within 3 days, then drive on to Antwerp within a week, splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace before American industrial power could become overwhelming. But that speed required roads. The Ardennes forest region had few paved roads capable of handling heavy armor, and 7 of those roads, 7 critical arteries for movement and supply, met at Bastogne. Von Lettwitz had argued for bypassing Bastogne entirely, leave a screening force, continue west, deal with the town later if necessary. But German High Command had overruled him. Field Marshal Walther Model, commanding Army Group B, sent explicit orders: Bastogne must be taken. You could not advance with an American garrison threatening your supply lines. You could not leave an intact enemy force in your rear. Bastogne had to fall, and it had to fall quickly. The problem was that quickly wasn't happening. Von Lettwitz's forces had been attacking Bastogne since December 19th. They'd surrounded it, They'd probed its defenses. They'd launched coordinated assaults. The Americans had given ground, pulled back from exposed positions, but the core defensive perimeter remained intact. Every hour spent fighting for Bastogne was an hour not spent driving west. The German timetable, already ambitious, was disintegrating. December 21st, 1000 hours. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Division, met with von Littwitz to argue his case. Bayerlein's division had been ordered to reduce Bastogne, but he believed it was impossible without substantial reinforcements. His division had already suffered significant casualties in the initial attacks. The Americans were fighting from prepared positions with good fields of fire. They had artillery support. They weren't collapsing. Bayerlein's frustration was evident. He was an experienced panzer commander who'd fought across France, and now he was being asked to besiege a town with forces designed for mobile warfare. Von Littwitz understood Bayerlein's frustration because he shared it. But orders were orders. He'd been given two options by High Command: reduce Bastogne with existing forces, or request additional divisions be diverted from the westward advance to help with the siege. The second option was unacceptable. It would fatally weaken the main offensive. So von Littwitz had to make do with what he had: Panzer Division attacking from the north, 2nd Panzer Division to the west, 26th Volksgrenadier Division from the east, and Führer Grenadier Brigade from the south. On paper, more than enough to overwhelm a single American division, on the ground proving barely sufficient. The German planning documents captured after the war revealed the extent of the miscalculation. German intelligence had estimated Bastogne was defended by 1 to 2 battalions, perhaps 1,500 to 3,000 men, remnants of units shattered during the initial offensive. The actual strength was 18,000 soldiers, including a full Airborne Division plus attachments. This intelligence failure had cascading consequences. Von Littwitz had allocated forces based on fighting a weak rearguard, not a division-strength garrison. His assault plans presumed token resistance that would collapse after a coordinated push. Instead, he faced a defense in depth that extracted a heavy toll for every position attacked. December 21st, 1400 hours. A radio message arrived from German High Command. Field Marshal Alfred Jodl, speaking with the authority of Hitler himself. Bastogne must fall immediately. The advance cannot continue with this threat to our flank. The message had the tone of someone ordering subordinates to achieve the impossible through sheer force of will. Von Littwitz read it, set it aside, and went back to planning assaults with the forces he actually possessed, rather than the forces he wished he had. The fuel situation was becoming critical for German operations everywhere, but particularly around Bastogne. German armor operated on captured Allied fuel depots. The plan had always been to seize gasoline and diesel from the Americans as the offensive rolled west. But the slower-than-planned advance meant German tanks were burning fuel faster than captured depots could replenish it. Panzer divisions that should have been at the Meuse were stalled east of Bastogne, their fuel gauges approaching empty. Von Littwitz watched fuel trucks crawl forward on clogged roads, knowing that every liter of gasoline spent reducing Bastogne was a liter unavailable for the main offensive. The casualties were mounting in ways that threatened German offensive capability. On December 20th alone, German forces attacking Bastogne had lost 300 to 400 men killed or wounded. December 21st had been equally costly. The defensive terrain favored the Americans. They fought from buildings and tree lines, with short interior lines that allowed rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors. The Germans attacked across open ground, channeled by roads, exposed to American artillery that was deadly accurate despite supposed ammunition shortages. The casualty exchange rate was running roughly 2-to-1, 2 German casualties for every American. For an offensive operation, that ratio was unsustainable. Von Lüttwitz's staff calculated the force requirements for a successful assault on Bastogne. Minimum 3 divisions in coordinated attack, with armor support and substantial artillery preparation. But von Lüttwitz had only portions of 4 divisions available, and they were needed to maintain the encirclement. If he concentrated forces for a major assault, the Americans might break out. If he maintained the encirclement, he lacked the mass for a decisive attack. It was a military problem with no good solution, only choices between different types of failure. The timeline pressure was immense. December 20th had been the date German planners projected for crossing the Meuse River. It was now December 21st, and German spearheads were still east of Bastogne, fighting for a town that should have fallen in hours. Every day of delay gave the Allies time to bring up reserves, time to reinforce threatened sectors, time to recognize the scale of the German offensive and react. The advantage of surprise, which had made the initial breakthrough possible, was eroding with each passing hour. German commanders watching the battle for Bastogne experienced a growing sense of dismay. This wasn't how the offensive was supposed to unfold. The Americans were supposed to be demoralized, retreating in disorder, unable to form coherent defensive lines. Instead, at Bastogne, they'd formed exactly such a line and were defending it with skill and determination. The airborne troops, elite soldiers, yes, but still just infantry without heavy weapons, were holding off armored divisions. It suggested either that the German offensive had overestimated its own capabilities or underestimated American resilience. Neither interpretation was comforting. The weather was another factor, constraining German options. Heavy fog and low clouds had persisted since the offensive began, grounding Allied air power. This was a blessing. German operations would have been impossible under clear skies, with Allied fighter bombers roaming at will. But the weather also limited German reconnaissance. They couldn't see what the Americans were doing inside Bastogne's perimeter. They couldn't conduct accurate aerial bombardment. They couldn't coordinate movements with the precision that would be possible in better visibility. The fog that protected them also blinded them. December 22nd morning. Von Lüttwitz made a decision. He would offer the Americans terms for surrender, not from a position of weakness. German forces still surrounded Bastogne, still outnumbered the garrison, still possessed the capability to assault the town, but from recognition that time was critical and a negotiated surrender might achieve his objectives faster than continued combat. His staff drafted an ultimatum. It spoke of the honorable surrender of the encircled town and warned of total annihilation if terms were refused. The language was formal, correct according to military protocol, but laced with threat. The ultimatum would be delivered under white flag that afternoon. Von Lüttwitz believed it might work. The Americans had to know their situation was desperate. Surrounded, low on supplies, no relief in sight. Any rational commander would at least consider the offer. What von Lüttwitz didn't fully appreciate was that rationality in military affairs isn't always the most important factor. Sometimes identity matters more. What soldiers believe about themselves, what they think they represent, what surrender would mean for their self-conception. The 101st Airborne Division had an identity built on never surrendering, never retreating without orders, holding positions regardless of odds. That identity was about to collide with German expectations. The commanders around Bastogne, studying their maps and calculating attack plans, were experiencing a phenomenon common in military history: the friction between planning and reality. Plans assumed certain conditions: enemy weakness, rapid advances, objectives secured on schedule. Reality delivered stubborn resistance, unexpected defensive capabilities, and objectives that remained just out of reach, despite repeated efforts. The gap between plan and reality was where campaigns went to die. What German commanders couldn't fully see from their headquarters positions was the human dimension of what was happening at Bastogne. Yes, the Americans were running low on supplies. Yes, they were surrounded. Yes, they were outnumbered. But none of that had broken their will to resist. If anything, the desperate circumstances had hardened that will, transformed it into something that couldn't be measured on casualty charts or ammunition inventories. The Americans at Bastogne had decided they weren't surrendering. They'd decided they were holding the town. And decisions sometimes matter more than capabilities. Von Littwitz prepared the ultimatum for delivery, convinced it represented a reasonable solution to an increasingly complex problem. He was about to discover that the Americans had a different idea of what was reasonable. December 20th, 1800 hours, Neuville. Major William de Sobry leaned against the stone wall of a Belgian farmhouse, trying to hear the radio through the ringing in his ears. His head throbbed from the concussion of near-miss artillery. Around him, Neuville burned. German shells had set houses ablaze throughout the afternoon, turning the village into a landscape of fire and smoke. De Sobry's command, what remained of it, held a perimeter measuring perhaps 400 yards across. They'd beaten back 3 German assaults. The question wasn't whether they could hold. The question was whether anyone would be alive to evacuate when the order finally came. Neuville had been untenable from the start, though it took a day of combat to prove it. The village sat on high ground 4 miles north of Bastogne, dominating the approach roads from Hoffelise. In theory, it was an ideal defensive position. In practice, it was a salient jutting out from the American perimeter, exposed on 3 sides, impossible to reinforce without running a gauntlet of German fire. De Sobry's team had fought brilliantly, destroying over 20 German tanks and inflicting hundreds of casualties. But brilliance had limits when you were surrounded by an entire Panzer division. The radio crackled. General McAuliffe's voice, distorted by static but unmistakable. Pull back to Foy. Execute withdrawal at 0900 tomorrow. Hold until then. De Sobry acknowledged the order and set down the handset. Around him his officers waited. He gave them the news without emotion. They were getting out, but they had to survive 1 more night first, then fight their way back 4 miles through German-held territory in daylight. Nobody cheered. Getting out alive from Neuville would be harder than getting in had been. The night of December 20th to 21st was endless for De Sobry's command. German forces, sensing the Americans might withdraw, increased the pressure. Artillery fell continuously, walking back and forth across Neuville's positions. German infantry probed the perimeter, testing for weak points. De Sobry moved between positions, checking on his men, redistributing ammunition from the dead to the living. His command had started with over 1,000 men and 20 tanks. Now he counted perhaps 400 effective soldiers and 4 operational Shermans. The rest were casualties or mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired under fire. December 21st, 0900 hours. The withdrawal began under covering fire from artillery positioned near Bastogne. De Sobry's plan was simple because complex plans fell apart under fire. The infantry would move first in a column, using the morning fog for concealment. The remaining tanks would form a rearguard, leapfrogging back in bounds, engaging any German forces that pursued. Wounded would be carried on vehicles or by walking wounded who could still move. Nothing would be left behind that could help the enemy. Disabled tanks were to be destroyed, ammunition expended or taken, radios smashed. The column moved out through Nouville's western edge. Immediately, German machine gun fire raked them from a tree line they hadn't known was occupied. Men dove for ditches. The tanks returned fire, their machine guns chewing up the tree line, buying seconds for infantry to scramble forward. It was going to be like this for 4 miles. Move, get shot at, return fire, move again, casualties mounting with each bound. Private First Class Robert Harwick, commanding the lead infantry company, after his lieutenant was killed, moved his men in short rushes, using every ditch and stone wall for cover. Behind them, Nouville disappeared into smoke and fog. The Germans realized the Americans were withdrawing and reacted aggressively. Panzer IVs appeared on the flanks, trying to cut off the column. Dessebre's remaining Shermans engaged them at ranges where you could see the faces of enemy tank commanders in their hatches. One Sherman brewed up after taking a hit in the engine compartment, its crew bailing out through hatches as flames consumed the interior. Another Sherman lost a track to German anti-tank fire and had to be abandoned, its crew destroyer rigging charges to the ammunition so the Germans couldn't use it. The explosion sent flames 200 feet into the air. Halfway to Foy, Decebre was wounded. An artillery shell landed close enough to throw him 10 feet, peppered his body with fragments, and left him partially deaf and disoriented. Major Robert Harwick assumed command and kept the column moving. There was no time to treat wounded, no time for anything except movement. Stand still and you died. Keep moving and you might reach friendly lines. The math was that simple. The column staggered into Foy at 1300 hours, 4 hours to cover 4 miles, every yard contested. Decebre's command had been reduced to fewer than 400 men, 4 tanks operational from the original 20. They'd fought one of the war's more remarkable small unit actions, holding Nouville against overwhelming force, then executing a fighting withdrawal through enemy-controlled territory. But the cost had been devastating. Over 600 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Vehicles destroyed, equipment abandoned. The survivors looked like men who'd aged years in days. South of Bastogne, a similar drama was unfolding. The village of Woerden, held by elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, was being overwhelmed. German infantry from the 5th Parachute Division attacked in strength on December 21st morning. The Americans defending Woerden numbered about 600 men. The Germans attacking numbered over 2,000, with assault guns providing close support. The outcome was mathematically predetermined. The fighting for Woerden devolved into the most primitive form of combat, house to house, room to room. Men grappling in the confined spaces of Belgian farmhouses. Staff Sergeant Elmer Sherwood held a stone house on Woerden's eastern edge for 3 hours with 7 men. They fired through windows and loopholes knocked through walls. They threw back German grenades before they exploded. When the Germans finally overran the house, only Sherwood and 1 other man were still fighting. They escaped through a basement window and ran through German positions back to American lines, both wounded, both somehow still alive. By midday December 21st, the 501st Battalion commander made the decision to withdraw from Woerden. The village couldn't be held without reinforcements that didn't exist. Better to preserve the battalion as a fighting force than sacrifice it in a doomed defense. The order to withdraw filtered down through company and platoon leaders. Men began pulling back by squads, maintaining fire discipline, covering each other's movement. The Germans pursued cautiously, having learned that these American paratroopers counterattacked at unexpected moments. The withdrawal from Warding cost another 200 casualties, men killed covering the retreat, wounded who couldn't be carried, soldiers who disappeared into the chaos and were never accounted for. But the battalion reached American lines intact enough to fight again. They'd bought time, which was all anyone could buy in these first days of the siege. Time for other units to dig in deeper. Time for artillery to pre-plot defensive fires. Time for commanders to understand the German attack patterns and adjust defensive plans accordingly. By evening December 21st, the American defensive perimeter had contracted to a circumference of roughly 6 miles. The new line was denser, more defensible, with fewer gaps and better fields of fire. Every unit knew exactly which sectors flanked them, where reserves were positioned, how to call for artillery support. The telephone wire that connected positions created a primitive but effective communications network. If radio failed, messengers could run. If messengers couldn't get through, every position knew to hold independently. The commanders reviewing the situation at McAuliffe's headquarters could see both the costs and the benefits of the contraction. They'd given up ground, Noville, Warden, several smaller villages, and Crossroads, but they'd preserved combat power. The units that withdrew were bloodied but not broken. They could fight again, and fight effectively, from positions that made better tactical sense. The price had been high in casualties and equipment, but the alternative, having those units overrun and destroyed in exposed positions, would have been catastrophic. The defensive doctrine was evolving through brutal trial and error. Artillery learned to mass fires on likely German approach routes before attacks developed fully. Tank destroyers learned to shoot and displace, never staying in one position long enough for German artillery to find them. Infantry learned to let German armor pass through positions, then engage the following infantry, separating the two arms and making both vulnerable. These weren't tactics from training manuals, they were improvisations forged under fire, lessons learned at the cost of lives. Private First Class Edward Penich, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, described the new perimeter in a letter he started but never finished. We pulled back to positions we can actually defend, lost a lot of good men doing it. But now we're dug in tight. Everyone knows their sector, and the bastards will pay for every yard if they try again. The letter was found on his body 3 days later, still in his pocket. 3 sentences capturing both the tactical logic and human cost of the withdrawal. The Germans, watching from their positions around the contracted perimeter, recognized what was happening. The Americans were no longer spread thin across an overextended line. They were consolidated, concentrated, defending from positions they'd had time to improve. The easy targets were gone. What remained was a hardened defensive nut that would crack only under sustained, coordinated assault. And time, the Germans' most precious resource, continued to slip away while they prepared those assaults. As darkness fell on December 21st, the new perimeter settled into an uneasy equilibrium. American soldiers in their foxholes could hear German vehicles moving in the darkness beyond the line, repositioning for the next attack. German soldiers in their positions could see the faint glow of Bastogne, a town that should have fallen days ago but remained defiantly in American hands. Between them lay frozen Belgian fields, crossed by occasional flares that cast shadows longer than the men who fired them. The siege was entering a new phase. The line was drawn. Now came the test of who could hold it, and for how long. December 22nd, 11:30 in the morning. 4 German officers appeared at the American lines near the village of Remolfos, walking slowly up the road under a white flag. They wore clean uniforms, polished boots, the kind of military precision that suggested men who'd had time to prepare for this moment. American sentries from F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, watched them approach with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. White flags could mean surrender, negotiation, or tricks. In 3 days of combat, the soldiers at Bastogne had learned to trust nothing. The German party consisted of 2 officers and 2 enlisted men carrying the flag. They stopped at the American roadblock and waited. A sergeant blindfolded them, standard procedure for anyone entering friendly positions, and escorted them to Major Alvin Jones's command post in a farmhouse several hundred yards back. The Germans carried a document, formal and typed on official Wehrmacht stationery. They requested it be delivered to the American commander. Their demeanor suggested they expected to be taken seriously. Major Jones read the ultimatum. The language was formal, almost courtly in its military correctness. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The document continued with warnings about civilian casualties if fighting continued, about the futility of resistance, about the serious civilian losses that would result from refusing terms. Jones looked up at the German officers. They waited with the patience of men who believed they'd made a reasonable offer. Jones told them to wait. He'd need to deliver this to division headquarters. The Germans were kept under guard, while Jones rushed the ultimatum to General McAuliffe at the Heinz barracks. It was just past noon when he burst into McAuliffe's office, document in hand, urgency written across his face. McAuliffe was reviewing casualty reports when Jones arrived. He took the German ultimatum, read it once quickly, then read it again more slowly. His initial response has become the most famous 2 words in American military history, though accounts vary slightly on the exact phrasing. What's documented is that McAuliffe's first reaction was dismissive and profane, "Oh, nuts." He tossed the document on his desk and went back to his casualty reports, as if the German offer merited no further consideration. His staff officers had a different reaction. They recognized the ultimatum as both an opportunity and a problem. An opportunity because it suggested German commanders were frustrated, perhaps doubting their ability to take Bastogne by force. A problem because it required a formal response, and the wrong response could have consequences for prisoners of war, for the civilian population, for the rules of warfare that theoretically constrained even this most brutal of conflicts. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, McAuliffe's operations officer, suggested they needed to draft a proper reply. McAuliffe considered for a moment, then made a decision that reflected both his personality and his assessment of the situation. They'd use his initial response. Just that. Knots. Kinnard thought he was joking. McAuliffe wasn't joking. It was the only response that properly conveyed his opinion of the German offer. His staff officers looked at each other, recognizing they were witnessing something that would either be remembered as brilliant defiance or catastrophic hubris, depending on how the next few days unfolded. The formal reply was typed on a single sheet of paper to the German commander Nuts, the American commander. That was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a single word that existed somewhere between profanity and dismissal. Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the honor of delivering the response to the German officers still waiting at F Company's command post. Harper found the German officers in a farmhouse, still blindfolded, drinking coffee that American soldiers had offered them. He had the blindfolds removed and handed them the typed response. The German major commanding the delegation read it, looked confused, and asked in heavily accented English what nuts meant. The linguistic subtlety of American slang had not been covered in his military training. Harper, enjoying the moment despite the circumstances, explained, It means go to hell. He paused, then added with emphasis, and I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city. The German officer's expressions shifted from confusion to something harder to read, perhaps surprise, perhaps respect, perhaps recognition that they'd misjudged their enemy. They were escorted back to the American lines, blindfolded again, and sent on their way. Behind them, American soldiers who'd watched the exchange began spreading the word. The general had told the Germans to go to hell. They'd demanded surrender, and McAuliffe had responded with a barnyard epithet. The story spread through the perimeter within hours, growing slightly in the telling, but fundamentally accurate in its essence. The psychological impact of McAuliffe's response exceeded any reasonable expectation. American soldiers who'd spent 3 days fighting against overwhelming odds with dwindling supplies suddenly had a story that defined their situation. They weren't desperate troops clinging to survival. They were defiant warriors who told enemy commanders to pound sand. The distinction mattered. It transformed the narrative from one of victimization to one of resistance. Men who might have been demoralized by their circumstances found energy in the sheer audacity of their commander's refusal. The response circulated through units in various forms. Some heard it as nuts, others as go to hell, still others as more colorful variations that McAuliffe probably never said, but which soldiers attributed to him anyway. The exact wording mattered less than the attitude it conveyed. The 101st Airborne Division wasn't surrendering. Not today, not tomorrow, not until every man was dead or out of ammunition. That identity, the division that refused to quit, had existed before Bastogne, but it crystallized in that single-word response to a German ultimatum. For the Germans, McAuliffe's response was both puzzling and disturbing. Von Lüttwitz, receiving the report from his officers, recognized that he'd fundamentally misread the American command. He'd expected a rational calculation of military possibilities. Surrounded forces, facing annihilation, offered honorable terms. Any reasonable commander would at least negotiate. But McAuliffe hadn't negotiated. He'd responded with what amounted to a middle finger rendered in military correspondence. It suggested either that the American commander knew something von Lüttwitz didn't, relief was imminent, supplies were better than intelligence suggested, or that the Americans were simply refusing to acknowledge reality. Von Lüttwitz increased preparations for a major assault. If the Americans wouldn't surrender, they'd have to be destroyed. He began consolidating forces, positioning artillery, coordinating with commanders of the divisions encircling Bastogne. The assault would come soon, probably within 48 hours. It would be coordinated, overwhelming, the kind of attack that would break through whatever the Americans had prepared. The refusal to surrender had sealed Bastogne's fate, or so von Lüttwitz believed. What he couldn't measure was how that same refusal had energized the defenders. Back in Bastogne, the mood had shifted perceptibly. Men still faced the same tactical situation, surrounded, outnumbered, running low on supplies. But morale, that intangible factor that military science struggled to quantify, had improved dramatically. Soldiers who'd been grimly determined were now almost eager for the next German attack. They had a story to tell, a commander who'd stood up to enemy demands, a division identity that meant something beyond tactical doctrine. They were the battered bastards of Bastogne, a nickname that was just beginning to circulate, and they'd earned it through 3 days of combat that had tested everything they thought they knew about themselves. Lieutenant Dick Winters, hearing the story about McAuliffe's response, recognized it as a masterpiece of leadership that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. It was emotional, visceral, the kind of gesture that resonated because it was authentic. McAuliffe hadn't calculated the perfect response. He'd responded instinctively, and that instinct had captured exactly what his troops needed to hear. They weren't victims of circumstance. They were warriors choosing defiance. The distinction would matter in the coming days when exhaustion and hunger and cold would test whether defiance could sustain them. The civilian population of Bastogne, hearing various versions of the story, had their own reaction. These Americans, who'd arrived just days ago, who'd immediately begun tearing up their town to create defensive positions, who'd brought war to their doorstep. These same Americans were refusing to surrender despite impossible odds. Some civilians found it inspiring. Others found it terrifying, recognizing that the refusal to surrender meant continued combat, more destruction, higher casualties. But all of them understood that their fates were now tied to the American garrison. If Bastogne fell, they'd fall with it. If it held, they'd survive. There was no middle ground. As evening fell on December 22nd, soldiers across the perimeter shared the story of McAuliffe's response. Some laughed at the sheer audacity of it. Others nodded in grim satisfaction. A few thought their commander was crazy, but they'd follow him anyway because that's what soldiers did. In foxholes scattered across 6 miles of frozen Belgian earth, men cleaned weapons and checked ammunition and prepared for whatever came next. They were still surrounded, they were still outnumbered, they were still running out of supplies, but they weren't surrendering. General McAuliffe had made that official. The word nuts would echo through military history, becoming synonymous with American defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. But on December 22nd, 1944, it was just one word on a piece of paper, delivered by soldiers who'd chosen to fight rather than yield. Everything else, the legend, the symbolism, the historical significance, would come later. That night it was simply a refusal, and sometimes in war, refusal is enough. December 23rd, 08:30 in the morning. Sergeant Mike Rennie, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, looked up from his foxhole and saw something he hadn't seen in 5 days. Blue sky. The fog that had shrouded Bastogne since the siege began was lifting, shredding apart in long tendrils as sunlight broke through. Around him, other soldiers were looking up too, blinking against the brightness, registering what clear weather meant. It meant the Air Corps could fly. It meant supplies. It meant they might survive after all. The weather had been Germany's greatest ally since the offensive began. Heavy fog, low clouds and snow had grounded Allied air power completely. The thousands of fighters and bombers stationed in France and England had sat idle while the ground battle raged. German commanders had planned the offensive around this weather window, knowing they needed at least a week of flying conditions that would keep Allied aircraft grounded. But weather, like everything else in war, refused to cooperate with plans. A high-pressure system was moving across Europe. The skies were clearing. At 0900 hours, the first C-47s appeared over Bastogne. They came in formation, 241 transport aircraft, flying in tight V patterns, their engines creating a roar that echoed across the perimeter. Soldiers who'd been fighting for 4 days with dwindling resources stood in their positions and watched the sky fill with airplanes. Some cheered. Others just stared, hardly believing what they were seeing. The aircraft were flying at low altitude, 1,500 feet, close enough that you could see the door gunners and the cargo doors beginning to open. The first parachutes blossomed red, white and blue against the winter sky. Hundreds of them, carrying supply bundles suspended beneath canopies that drifted down toward the American perimeter. Pathfinder teams on the ground had marked drop zones with colored panels, guiding the aircraft toward areas where supplies could be recovered quickly. But even bundles that drifted outside the perimeter were sometimes worth recovering, soldiers would sprint into no man's land, grab a bundle, and drag it back under covering fire from their positions. The drop lasted through mid-morning. Wave after wave of C-47s released their cargo, banked away, and headed back to bases in France and England. A few aircraft were hit by German anti-aircraft fire. Black puffs of flak dotted the sky, and one C-47 trailing smoke made an emergency landing inside the perimeter, but the vast majority completed their drops successfully. By 1100 hours, 144 tons of supplies had fallen into or near the American positions. Artillery ammunition was priority one. 50 tons of shells for the howitzers that had been rationed to 10 rounds per gun. Medical supplies came next: plasma, morphine, bandages, surgical instruments, then food, small arms ammunition, and miscellaneous equipment. Recovery teams scrambled across the drop zones, collecting bundles and hauling them to distribution points. The efficiency was remarkable. Soldiers who'd spent days conserving every round suddenly had ammunition to spare. Artillery crews who'd been counting shells like misers now had enough to fire full missions. Surgeons who'd been reusing bandages now had fresh medical supplies. The resupply didn't solve every problem. Food was still rationed, fuel for vehicles remained scarce, winter clothing was still inadequate, but it transformed the situation from terminal to survivable. Lieutenant Colonel Coles, the supply officer who'd spent days calculating consumption rates with the precision of an accountant facing bankruptcy, allowed himself a moment of relief. The aerial resupply had bought them perhaps a week of combat capability, maybe more if soldiers remained disciplined about conservation. But more important than the mathematics was the psychological impact. The garrison had been cut off, isolated, seemingly abandoned. Now they had proof that the outside world knew they existed and was trying to help. That mattered more than any amount of ammunition. At 1300 hours, the first fighter bombers arrived. P-47 Thunderbolts, flying in sections of 4, began working over German positions around the perimeter. They came in low, their 50 caliber machine guns raking German artillery positions and armor concentrations. They dropped 500-pound bombs on suspected German headquarters and supply dumps. They strafed roads where German convoys were trying to move reinforcements and ammunition forward. The American soldiers at Bastogne stood in their foxholes and cheered as German positions erupted in flames and explosions. The Thunderbolts were followed by P-38s, then by more fighter bombers throughout the afternoon. Over 250 sorties were flown on December 23rd alone, targeting any German position that air controllers on the ground identified as threatening. The effect was devastating. German artillery batteries, which had been pounding Bastogne with near impunity, found themselves under attack from aircraft that appeared with little warning. German armor, which had been maneuvering for assault positions, was forced to disperse and seek cover. The German build-up for a major assault was disrupted before it could fully develop. For the Germans around Bastogne, December 23rd was the day the situation fundamentally changed. They'd grown accustomed to operating without air threat, moving in daylight, concentrating forces without fear of attack from above. Suddenly, the sky was full of enemy aircraft. Every concentration of vehicles drew attack. Every artillery position was vulnerable. Movement during daylight became suicidal. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to provide air cover for the offensive, was virtually absent. Its few operational fighters were overwhelmed by Allied numbers and fled rather than engage. Staff Sergeant Dom Malarkey, Easy Company, 506 VR, watched the air attacks from his foxhole near Foy. He'd been in continuous combat since D-Day, had seen close air support in Normandy and Holland, But this was different in scale and intensity. The Thunderbolts were working over German positions with the methodical efficiency of men who knew their targets couldn't shoot back effectively. Each pass meant more German casualties, more destroyed equipment, more disruption of enemy plans. Malarkey turned to the soldier next to him and said what everyone was thinking: we might actually make it. The resupply and air support on December 23rd didn't end the siege. German forces still surrounded Bastogne. The garrison was still cut off from ground reinforcement. The tactical situation remained desperate by any conventional assessment. But the psychological situation had transformed completely. Soldiers who'd been grimly holding on, expecting to die before relief arrived, now had hope. They had ammunition. They had air support. They had proof that they weren't forgotten. The weather forecast called for continued clear skies for at least 3 to 4 days. That meant sustained resupply, daily air support, and growing German losses from air attack. It also meant Allied reconnaissance aircraft could photograph German positions, providing intelligence that had been unavailable during the fog. Photo interpreters studying the images counted German armor, identified unit insignia, plotted defensive positions. The intelligence picture, which had been virtually blind during the first days of the siege, suddenly became clear and detailed. General McAuliffe, reviewing the situation that evening, allowed himself cautious optimism. The garrison could hold indefinitely with continued aerial resupply. The German offensive was losing momentum. Reconnaissance reports indicated German spearheads had been stopped west of Bastogne, their fuel exhausted, their advance stalled, relief forces were being assembled to the south. Patton's Third Army was pivoting north for a counterattack. Time, which had been the enemy for the first 4 days of the siege, was becoming an ally. Every day Bastogne held was a day closer to relief. But McAuliffe was experienced enough to know that clear weather wouldn't last forever. Another front could move through, bringing fog and clouds that would ground the Air Corps again. The Germans knew this too, and they'd be planning their next major assault accordingly. The battle for Bastogne wasn't over. It was entering a new phase, one where both sides raced against time and weather, trying to achieve their objectives before conditions changed again. As darkness fell, on December 23rd, the soldiers at Bastogne settled into their positions with something approaching confidence. They had ammunition for their weapons. They had food in their stomachs. Not much, still rationed, but more than they'd had yesterday. They had air support that had bloodied the Germans throughout the day, and they had the knowledge that someone somewhere was fighting to reach them. Relief was coming. They just had to hold until it arrived. Private First Class Walter Gordon, 501st PA, wrote in a letter that night, "The sky opened up today and supplies rained down. We got ammo, food, medical supplies, everything we needed. The Air Corps hit the carts all day long. You could hear them screaming, 'This is still tough. We're still surrounded, but now we got a fighting chance.' That's all a soldier can ask for." The letter would reach his family 3 weeks later, but the sentiment captured the transformation that December 23rd represented: a fighting chance. Against overwhelming odds, outnumbered and surrounded. Sometimes that's enough. The Germans, watching the aerial resupply and air attacks, recognized that their window of opportunity was closing. The weather advantage that had made the offensive possible was gone. Allied air power, the great equalizer that German commanders feared more than any ground force, was back in action. Von Lüttwitz and his subordinates knew they had perhaps 24 to 48 hours to break Bastogne before the accumulated weight of Allied air superiority made further offensive operations impossible. The assault would come soon. It would have to be massive, coordinated and successful. There would be no second chance. The sky had opened. Supplies had fallen. Air support had arrived. For the American garrison at Bastogne, December 23rd was the day the siege became survivable. For the Germans surrounding them, it was the day their offensive began its long slide toward failure. Neither side fully understood this yet. Both prepared for the battle that would determine whether Bastogne held or fell. That battle would come tomorrow, on Christmas Eve, and it would be the most desperate fighting of the entire siege. December 24th, 03:30 in the morning. The German artillery barrage began without warning, shells screaming out of the darkness to impact across American positions west and northwest of Bastogne. Over 1,000 rounds in 30 minutes, the heaviest bombardment of the siege. The earth shook, buildings collapsed, foxholes caved in. Men who'd been sleeping were jolted awake by concussions that rattled their teeth and stole the air from their lungs. This wasn't harassment fire or ranging shots. This was preparation fire for a major assault. The barrage concentrated on a 2-mile section of the perimeter near the villages of Champs and Hemril. German commanders had identified this sector as potentially weak. It was held by the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and elements of the 327th Glider Infantry, units that had already taken casualties in earlier fighting. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Saturate the sector with artillery, send in armor and infantry under cover of darkness, break through before dawn, roll up the American perimeter from the inside. If executed properly, Bastogne would fall before breakfast. At 05:30, with the artillery barrage still falling, German armor began moving. 15 Panzer IVs and Panthers from Panzer Division, supported by over 2,000 infantry from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Regiment and Führer Grenadier Brigade, advanced on Champs from 3 directions. They came through the pre-dawn darkness using tactics refined over 5 years of war, infantry moving alongside tanks, supporting each other, engineers ready to clear obstacles, assault guns providing direct fire support. It was the German army at its most professional and most dangerous. The fog had returned overnight, thick enough that visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. German tanks materialized out of the darkness like steel ghosts, their engines rumbling, their commanders buttoned up against expected American fire. They rolled through positions that should have been suppressed by the artillery barrage. They expected minimal resistance. What they got was a concentrated storm of anti-tank fire that lit up the pre-dawn fog like a thunderstorm. The key to the American defense was the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, their M18 Hellcats, lightly armored but mounting 76mm guns that could penetrate any German tank, had been positioned in concealment around Champs. They'd survived the artillery barrage by pulling back during the shelling, then moving forward again as soon as it lifted. Now, as German tanks emerged from the fog, the Hellcats opened fire at ranges where missing was almost impossible. Sergeant Oswald Butler commanded a Hellcat positioned in a sunken road west of Champs. Through the fog, he saw the distinctive silhouette of a Panther tank at perhaps 75 yards. He fired without hesitation. The 76mm shell punched through the Panther's side armor, the point where hull met turret, the weak spot every American tank destroyer crew knew to target. The German tank lurched to a stop, flames erupting from its hatches. Butler's crew reloaded in seconds. Another Panther appeared. Butler fired again. Another hit. Another kill. In the span of 5 minutes, Butler's crew destroyed 4 German tanks before displacing to avoid return fire. The battle for Champs dissolved into close-quarters chaos. German infantry penetrated into the village, moving through buildings, throwing grenades, clearing rooms. American paratroopers from the 502nd PIR counterattacked, knowing that letting the Germans establish positions inside Champs would mean the perimeter was broken. Men fought in the darkness with rifles, grenades, knives, anything that came to hand. The tracers from machine guns crisscrossed the fog-shrouded streets, creating patterns of light and death. Private First Class Leo Palmer, Company C, 502nd PIR, defended a stone building on Champs' northern edge. German infantry were advancing through a courtyard, using a stone wall for cover. Palmer and his squad fired from windows, their M1s cracking in rapid semi-automatic sequences. Germans fell, but others kept coming. Palmer ran out of ammunition, grabbed a German Mauser from a dead soldier outside the window, kept firing. The building filled with smoke and the smell of cordite and blood. Outside, a German Panzer IV fired its 75mm gun at the building, the shells punching through stone walls like they were paper. By 07:30, with dawn beginning to lighten the fog, the German assault was stalling. 18 German tanks had been destroyed, burned out hulls littering the approaches to Champs, some still burning, black smoke adding to the fog. German infantry casualties exceeded 300 killed and wounded. The Americans had held their positions, barely, by the narrowest of margins. But they'd held. The perimeter remained intact. South of Champs, another German assault hit Hemruhe with similar fury. Panthers and Panzer IVs, supported by infantry, attacked through the fog, trying to break through positions held by the 327th Glider Infantry. The pattern was similar, German tanks advancing confidently until American anti-tank fire erupted from concealment. Tank destroyer crews from the 635th Tank Destroyer Battalion destroyed 7 German tanks in the first 30 minutes of the assault. The Germans pushed infantry forward, trying to clear the anti-tank positions. The glider infantry held firm, firing from prepared positions, refusing to yield ground. The fighting at Hemruhe was complicated by the terrain, rolling farmland with scattered woods, providing concealment for both sides. German tanks would appear from tree lines, fire several rounds, then pull back before American tank destroyers could get solid shots. American infantry used bazookas at suicidally close range, knowing that stopping German armor was more important than personal survival. Corporal Willis Fowler knocked out a Panther from 30 yards with a bazooka shot to the engine deck. The tank's explosion threw him 20 feet. He survived somehow with burns and a broken arm, and crawled back to American lines still carrying his bazooka. By 1000 hours, the German Christmas Eve assault had clearly failed. Their commanders, watching from observation posts, could see the evidence scattered across the snow: burned tanks, dead infantry, assault units that had been repulsed with heavy casualties. The Americans had not only held their positions, they'd inflicted losses that the German units couldn't afford. The casualty ratio was running nearly 5-to-1, 5 German casualties for every American. For an attacking force, that ratio was catastrophic. What the Germans couldn't see was how close they'd come to breaking through. At several points during the assault, German infantry had penetrated 200 yards into American positions. If they'd been able to exploit those penetrations, if they'd had reserves to throw in at the critical moment, the outcome might have been different. But German resources were exhausted. They'd committed their available armor and infantry to the assault. When that assault failed to achieve breakthrough, they had nothing left to commit. The offensive capability around Bastogne was spent. The American artillery had been crucial to the defense. Despite ammunition constraints, gun crews had fired over 4,000 rounds on December 24th, concentrating fire on German assembly areas and approach routes. Forward observers called in missions with impressive accuracy, dropping shells on German positions that were threatening American lines. The artillery had been rationed for days, conserving ammunition. On Christmas Eve, they expended the conserved ammunition in massive concentrations that shattered German attacks before they could fully develop. Medical personnel worked through the battle in the Bastogne seminary and other aid stations scattered around the perimeter. The wounded came in streams, men with shrapnel wounds, burns from tank fires, bullet wounds, blast injuries, frostbite cases that were nearly as serious as combat injuries. Surgeons operated continuously, making split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. Major John Pryor later described Christmas Eve as the busiest day of his medical career, more casualties in 12 hours than he'd treated in previous months of combat. By 1400 hours, the battlefield had gone quiet. German forces pulled back to their starting positions, carrying their wounded, abandoning disabled tanks that couldn't be recovered under fire. American forces maintained their positions, redistributed ammunition, tended to their wounded, and prepared for the next attack. Both sides were exhausted. The difference was that the Americans had held their ground. In siege warfare, that counted as victory. General McAuliffe toured the perimeter that afternoon, visiting units that had borne the brunt of the assault. He didn't make speeches or deliver inspirational messages. He just walked the line, shook hands, asked how soldiers were doing, listened to their accounts of the fighting. His presence communicated more than words could. The commander sharing the danger, acknowledging the sacrifice, recognizing what his troops had endured. Officers who watched McAuliffe that afternoon saw a leader who understood that sometimes showing up was the most important thing you could do. The soldiers defending Champs and Hemrule knew they'd been in the fight of their lives. Some units had taken 50% casualties. Ammunition was expended at rates that would have been unsustainable except for the aerial resupply the day before. Equipment was damaged or destroyed. Men were at the ragged edge of exhaustion, but they'd held against coordinated assault by German armor and infantry. They'd maintained the perimeter intact. It was the kind of defensive success that couldn't be measured just in tactical terms. It was proof that the garrison could withstand the worst the Germans could throw at them. As evening fell on Christmas Eve, soldiers prepared for what they expected would be another night of combat. But the attacks didn't come. The Germans were regrouping, assessing casualties, trying to determine if they had the capability for another major assault. The Americans used the respite to improve positions, bring up supplies from the drop zones, evacuate the worst wounded to aid stations. The battle wasn't over, but the crisis had passed. Bastogne would not fall on Christmas Eve. Private First Class John Taylor, 502nd PIR, who'd fought all morning at Champs, wrote a letter that night, by the light of a candle stub. "We stopped them today. Cost us, but we stopped them. They threw everything at us. Tanks, artillery, infantry, the works. We just kept shooting, and they kept dying. Don't know how much more we can take, but we took everything they had today, and we're still here. Merry Christmas from Bastogne." The letter captured both the exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of men who'd been tested at the limit of endurance and hadn't broken. The Christmas Eve assault was the Germans' best chance to break Bastogne. They'd achieved surprise with the dawn timing. They'd concentrated overwhelming force on a narrow sector. They'd employed combined arms tactics professionally, and they'd failed. The failure wasn't due to any single factor. American anti-tank gunnery, artillery fire, infantry courage, defensive preparation all contributed. But the cumulative effect was decisive. The Germans would attack again, but never with the strength and coordination of Christmas Eve. The tide was turning. though few on either side fully recognized it yet. Bastogne had survived its worst day. What came next would determine if survival translated into victory. December 25th, 0600 hours. Dawn came quiet to Bastogne. The first morning in a week without the crash of artillery or the rumble of tank engines. Soldiers in frozen foxholes around the perimeter waited for attacks that didn't come, straining to hear sounds of German movement that remained absent. The silence was unnerving. Men who'd grown accustomed to constant combat found themselves unsettled by peace, however temporary. Some cleaned weapons compulsively, needing something to do with hands that wanted to shake from accumulated stress. The relative quiet wasn't accidental. German forces around Bastogne were regrouping after the failed Christmas Eve assault. They'd suffered over 700 casualties in a single day, killed, wounded, and captured. 25 tanks destroyed, infantry units reduced to 50% strength. Assault battalions that had attacked at full power were now barely combat effective. German commanders were assessing whether they had the capability for another major attack, or whether Bastogne would have to be contained while the main offensive continued west. The decision was being debated at higher headquarters, while soldiers on both sides enjoyed an unexpected reprieve. At 0900, Chaplain Francis Sampson held field mass in a bombed-out barn near the centre of Bastogne. Word had spread through the units during the night. Christmas services at 0900 for anyone who could attend. Nearly 200 soldiers crowded into the barn, sitting on broken beams and piles of rubble, weapons stacked against walls within easy reach. Sampson conducted the service with the calm dignity of a man who'd already administered last rites to dozens of dying soldiers in the past week. His homily was brief: be thankful for survival, remember absent friends, trust in Providence. No one recorded his exact words, but everyone who attended remembered the feeling, a moment of grace in the midst of chaos. The morning was strange in its ordinariness. Soldiers ate K rations that tasted like every other K ration they'd eaten. But somehow the fact that it was Christmas made the meal feel special. They shared cigarettes, the last luxuries that hadn't been entirely consumed. Some units organized distributions of the Christmas packages that had arrived in the December 23rd resupply drop. Small packages from rear echelon units containing candy, gum, writing paper, trivial things that became treasures when you were living in a foxhole at the edge of survival. Photographs from December 25th show soldiers smiling despite everything. The smiles look forced in some images, genuine in others, but they're there. Men posed with helmets decorated with evergreen branches. Others made jokes for cameras, mugging for posterity, creating moments of normalcy through sheer force of will. The photographs don't show the wounds, the fear, the exhaustion written into every face. But they show men determined to celebrate Christmas, despite being surrounded by an army trying to kill them. That determination mattered more than tactics or firepower. General McAuliffe distributed his Christmas message to all units. What's merry about all this, you ask? We're fighting, it's cold, we aren't home. All true, but what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this: we have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south, and west. We have identifications from 4 German Panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key points when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history, not alone in our division's glorious history, but in world history. The Germans actually did surround us. Their radios blared our doom. Their commander demanded our surrender in the following impudent arrogance. December 22nd, 1944. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. We continue to hold Bastogne. By holding Bastogne, we assure the success of the Allied armies. We know that our division commander, General Taylor, will say, "Well done. We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present, and being privileged to take part in this gallant feat of arms, we are truly making for ourselves a Merry Christmas." The message circulated through units typed on mimeographed sheets that soldiers folded and tucked into pockets. Some read it with cynicism, officers trying to make them feel good about a miserable situation. Others found genuine inspiration in the words, particularly the reminder that they were accomplishing something significant. They weren't just surviving, they were stopping a German offensive that might have changed the war's outcome. The distinction mattered. Lieutenant Dick Winters, reading the message to his platoon, added his own observation, "We're going to remember this Christmas for the rest of our lives. 50 years from now, we'll tell our grandchildren we spent Christmas 1944 surrounded by Germans in a Belgian town nobody ever heard of. And we held. That's not nothing." His words captured what many soldiers were feeling. This was a shared experience that would define them, for better or worse, long after the war ended. Medical personnel used the relative quiet to catch up on treating wounded who'd been stabilized, but not fully treated during the previous day's intense fighting. The seminary aid station remained crowded with casualties. Men waiting for evacuation, men too badly wounded to move, men who'd die regardless of treatment but were being kept comfortable. Major John Pryor and his surgeons worked through Christmas Day, performing surgeries that had been delayed by more urgent cases. A man with a shrapnel wound that needed debridement but wasn't life-threatening. Another with a fractured leg that needed setting. The routine medical care that becomes impossible during active combat. Resupply drops continued on Christmas Day, though at reduced rates compared to December 23rd. 160 tons of supplies fell into the perimeter, more ammunition, more food, more medical supplies. The aerial resupply had become routine, expected rather than miraculous, but each drop meant survival remained possible. Each pallet of artillery shells meant the guns could keep firing. Each bundle of morphine meant wounded soldiers could die with less pain. The logistics of siege warfare were unforgiving. You fought with what you had, and when that ran out, you died or surrendered. The Belgian civilians trapped in Bastogne attempted their own Christmas observations. Families gathered in cellars that had become shelters from artillery fire. They shared what food remained: potatoes, preserved vegetables, occasionally bread baked in improvised ovens. Some attended Christmas services in churches that had been damaged but remained partially functional. They prayed for deliverance, for an end to the fighting, for survival. Many had relatives fighting with Belgian resistance forces or serving with Allied units. Others had family members who'd fled or been killed in earlier fighting. Christmas 1944 was for Bastogne's civilians a holiday defined by absence and endurance. American soldiers shared food and cigarettes with Belgian civilians when they could. Some units distributed K-ration chocolate bars to children, small gestures that meant more than the chocolate's actual value. The relationship between occupying American forces and Belgian civilians was complicated. Gratitude for liberation mixed with resentment at being trapped in a combat zone. Appreciation for protection mixed with fear of being caught between armies. But on Christmas Day, those complications faded slightly. Everyone trapped in Bastogne shared a common interest in survival that created temporary bonds that transcended nationality and language. Artillery exchanges were light throughout the day. German guns fired harassment rounds, dropping shells randomly across the perimeter without specific tactical purpose. American artillery responded sparingly, conserving ammunition for defensive fires. The absence of sustained bombardment allowed soldiers to move above ground, to visit neighboring positions, to conduct small maintenance tasks that had been impossible under fire. Men heated water over small fires, the first hot drinks they'd had in days. Others shaved, trying to maintain some semblance of military appearance. Small rituals of normality in an abnormal situation. As afternoon faded toward evening, sounds of singing drifted across the lines. From German positions, voices raised in Stille Nacht, Silent Night, the carol that had originated in Austria a century earlier. American soldiers listened, some joining in with English lyrics from their foxholes. The moment was brief, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, before the war reasserted itself with sporadic machine gun fire. But for those minutes the singing created a space where men on both sides remembered they were human beings rather than just soldiers trying to kill each other. Private First Class Edward Pennish, listening to the singing from his foxhole, later wrote, "We were trying to kill each other yesterday. We'll try to kill each other tomorrow. But tonight, on Christmas, we sang the same song from opposite sides of a battlefield. War makes no sense. But I guess we already knew that." His words captured the cognitive dissonance of celebrating Christmas while surrounded by enemies, of recognizing shared humanity with people you'd shoot without hesitation in daylight. Night fell on Christmas 1944, with Bastogne still holding, still surrounded, but still defiant. The day had provided respite, but not resolution. German forces remained in position. American forces remained besieged. The tactical situation was fundamentally unchanged. But something intangible had shifted. The soldiers defending Bastogne had survived another day. They'd celebrated Christmas in the most unlikely circumstances. They'd proven to themselves that they could endure not just combat, but the psychological weight of siege warfare. That proof mattered. In command posts and foxholes across the perimeter, soldiers settled in for another night. They checked weapons, redistributed ammunition, posted sentries, prepared for attacks that might come at any hour. But they also carried memories of the day just ending, the service in the barn, the Christmas message, the singing across the lines, the small moments of grace that war couldn't entirely eradicate. Those memories would sustain them through what came next, because what came next would test them again in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The siege wasn't over. Christmas was. Tomorrow the war would resume with all its brutal certainty. December 26th, 0400 hours. German probing attacks resumed across the Bastogne perimeter, testing American positions at multiple points simultaneously. These weren't the coordinated assaults of Christmas Eve. No massed armor, no preparation barrages, no attempt at breakthrough. These were reconnaissance in force, company-sized attacks designed to identify weak points, to keep American soldiers sleep-deprived and stressed, to maintain pressure without committing to full-scale assault. The character of the siege had changed. This was attritional warfare, grinding combat designed to wear down defenders through accumulated stress and casualties. The pattern repeated throughout December 26th and 27th, probing attacks, artillery harassment, sniper fire, small unit actions that generated casualties without decisive results. An American position would come under fire, call for artillery support, repel the attack. 3 hours later, a different sector would be hit. Then another. The Germans were working systematically around the perimeter, never giving defenders rest, always forcing someone somewhere to be fighting. It was exhausting in ways that major battles weren't. Constant low-level stress, with no clear culminating point, just endless repetition. Lieutenant Dick Winters, observing German tactics from his position near Foy, recognized what was happening. The Germans had concluded they couldn't break Bastogne by direct assault, so they were trying to break it through attrition. Keep attacking, keep inflicting casualties, keep the pressure constant, and eventually the defenders would reach a breaking point where combat effectiveness collapsed. It was a valid strategy if you had time and replacements. The question was whether the Germans had either. December 26, 1300 hours. A firefight erupted in the Asenor sector on the southern perimeter. German reconnaissance troops, about 40 men moving through woods, encountered American outposts from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. The engagement lasted 20 minutes, small arms fire crackling through trees, both sides taking cover behind anything available. When it ended, 7 Germans were dead, 3 Americans wounded, tactically insignificant. But multiply that engagement by dozens occurring daily around the perimeter, and the casualty toll became significant. Medical personnel documented the shift in wound patterns during these grinding days. Early in the siege, casualties came in waves, corresponding to major attacks, surgeons overwhelmed during assaults. Then periods of relative calm. Now casualties arrived steadily, continuously. A sniper victim here, a man wounded by artillery fragments there, a soldier hit during a patrol. The aid stations maintained constant operations, treating wounds that individually were routine, but collectively exhausted medical supplies and personnel. Major John Pryor later described it as assembly line medicine. Treat, stabilize, evacuate or hold, move to the next patient, repeat endlessly. The trenchfoot crisis reached critical levels during these days. Soldiers had been in foxholes for over a week, feet constantly wet and cold, no opportunity to dry boots or change socks. The condition started with numbness and tingling, progressed to swelling and pain, and ended with tissue death requiring amputation. 500 documented cases by December 27th, with more soldiers suffering symptoms but remaining on the line because replacements didn't exist. Battalion commanders faced impossible choices: pull men with trenchfoot from combat and weaken the perimeter, or leave them fighting and risk permanent disability. December 27th. Morning. A sniper duel developed in the woods east of Bastogne. German sharpshooters had infiltrated close to American positions during darkness, taking up positions in tree stands and concealed firing points. American soldiers moving between positions started taking casualties, single shots precisely aimed from weapons with telescopic sights. Lieutenant Winters organized counter-sniper operations, using his own marksmanship skills and those of selected soldiers to hunt the German shooters. The duel lasted through the day, a deadly game of patience and precision that neither side could afford to lose. Artillery harassment became a psychological weapon during these grinding days. German guns would fire single rounds at irregular intervals, dropping shells randomly across the perimeter. No pattern, no warning, just sudden explosions that kept everyone on edge. You couldn't predict where the next shell would land. You couldn't take cover because there was no advance warning. You just lived with the constant possibility of sudden death from the sky. Some soldiers handled it better than others. Those who couldn't handle it still had to function, because there was nowhere to go for relief. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Temperatures remained in the teens during the day, dropped below zero at night. Soldiers wore every piece of clothing they possessed, and still shivered in their foxholes. They couldn't build fires, smoke would draw artillery, they couldn't move around to stay warm. Movement drew sniper fire, they sat in holes dug into frozen earth and endured, knowing that cold injuries could be as debilitating as combat wounds. Some soldiers lost fingers and toes to frostbite, others developed hypothermia that slowed reactions and clouded judgment. Food remained rationed, despite the aerial resupply. K rations provided calories but not satisfaction. 2 meals per day became standard, enough to sustain life, but not enough to feel full. Hungry soldiers had less energy, made more mistakes, became more susceptible to cold and disease. But food supplies had to be conserved because no one knew how long the siege would last. Relief was supposedly coming from the south. Patton's Third Army was attacking toward Bastogne, but when it would arrive remained uncertain. December 27th, night. German infiltration attempts probed the perimeter darkness. Small groups of German infantry, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, would try to slip through American positions to gather intelligence or create confusion. Sentries had to remain constantly alert, watching for movement, listening for sounds that might indicate infiltrators. Several times, German soldiers penetrated deep enough to reach American artillery positions before being detected and killed or captured. The incidents created paranoia. Every shadow might be an enemy, every sound a threat. The soldiers defending Bastogne were aging visibly during these grinding days. Not chronologically, the siege was measured in days, not years, but in the way men age under sustained stress. Faces became gaunt from hunger and sleep deprivation. Eyes developed the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen too much death. Hands shook from constant adrenaline surges with no outlet. These were physical manifestations of psychological strain that had no immediate remedy. You couldn't sleep your way out of it because there was no safe sleep. You couldn't talk your way through it because everyone around you was experiencing the same thing. Casualty statistics for December 26th through 28th tell the story in numbers. Americans 212 killed, wounded, or missing. Germans approximately 350 killed, wounded, or captured. The exchange rate favored the defenders. Defensive positions and better fields of fire gave Americans tactical advantage. But the Americans couldn't afford even favorable exchange rates indefinitely. The garrison had no replacements. Every casualty weakened the perimeter. The Germans theoretically had access to reinforcements from units elsewhere in the offensive, though in practice, by late December, German reserves were as exhausted as American forces. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, McAuliffe's operations officer, plotted casualty rates on a graph and ran projections. At current attrition rates, the garrison would fall below minimum defensive strength in approximately 14 days. That assumed no major German assaults and continued aerial resupply. Any change in those assumptions, weather closing in, German reinforcements arriving, supplies disrupted, would accelerate the timeline. Kinnard presented his analysis to McAuliffe, who studied the numbers and said simply, "Then Patton better get here in less than 14 days." The exchange captured the reality that siege warfare was ultimately a race between relief and exhaustion. German commanders were running similar calculations. Von Luttwitz's staff estimated American strength inside Bastogne at 12,000 to 14,000 effective soldiers. Lower than actual numbers, but close enough. They calculated that maintaining current pressure would reduce American combat effectiveness to critical levels within 2 weeks. But 2 weeks was time the Germans didn't have. The broader Ardennes offensive was stalling. Fuel shortages were paralyzing German armor across the front. Allied reinforcements were arriving daily. The strategic window was closing while tactical operations ground forward with agonizing slowness. December 28th. All day. The pattern continued, probing attacks, artillery exchanges, small unit actions, casualties mounting incrementally. American soldiers cleaned weapons for the 100th time, redistributed ammunition, stood watches, tried to stay warm and alert and alive. German soldiers did the same from their positions around the perimeter. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides continued fighting because there was no alternative except surrender or death, and neither was acceptable. Private First Class Kurt Gabel, writing in a small notebook he kept hidden in his jacket, captured the grinding nature of these days. It's not the big attacks that get you, it's this constant wear. Every day we lose a few more guys. Every day we're a little hungrier, a little colder, a little more tired. You wake up every morning surprised you're still alive. You go to sleep every night wondering if you'll wake up. This is what they don't show in the movies. War is a slow grinding down of everything human until all that's left is the part that keeps fighting because it doesn't know how to stop. The grinding days, December 26 through 28, lacked the drama of Christmas Eve's major assault or the hope of December 23rd's resupply. They were war at its most unglamorous and unforgiving. No decisive battles, no clear victories or defeats, just the daily accumulation of small actions that collectively determined whether the perimeter would hold. Soldiers who survived these days often remembered them as harder than the major battles. At least during a major battle, adrenaline carried you through. During the grinding days, there was just exhaustion and the knowledge that it would be the same tomorrow and the day after until either relief arrived or something broke. Bastogne held through the grinding days, but it held by increasingly narrow margins. Units were understrength. Supplies were adequate but not abundant. Morale remained surprisingly high. Soldiers took pride in their endurance, but psychological strain was accumulating in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until years later. The siege was entering its second week. How many more weeks could the garrison endure? Nobody knew. Everyone hoped they wouldn't have to find out. December 22nd, Patton's headquarters, Luxembourg City. General George S. Patton stood over a map of eastern France and Belgium, studying terrain features with the intensity of a man calculating the impossible. His chief of staff had just briefed him on orders from Supreme Headquarters: pivot 3rd Army 90 degrees north, attack toward Bastogne, relieve the 101st Airborne Division. The timeline was insane. Eisenhower wanted the attack to begin in 48 hours. Patton's entire army, currently engaged along a 100-mile front, would have to disengage, rotate north, and launch a coordinated offensive with divisions that had barely met each other. It was the kind of operation that military textbooks said required weeks of preparation. Patton's response entered military legend: "I'll be in Bastogne by Christmas." His staff looked at him like he'd lost his mind. The distance from current 3rd Army positions to Bastogne was 75 miles. Between those positions and Bastogne sat substantial German forces, multiple divisions prepared defenses, the same German army that had just shattered 2 American divisions and surrounded Bastogne. Attacking through that in 3 days wasn't optimistic. It was delusional. But Patton wasn't interested in what couldn't be done. He was interested in attack. Always attack. Speed and aggression would compensate for planning, or so he believed. The force Patton assembled for the relief operation was formidable on paper. 4th Armored Division would be the spearhead tanks and armored infantry designed for breakthrough operations. 26th Infantry Division would attack on the left flank, 80th Infantry Division on the right. In total, approximately 60,000 men with supporting artillery and air cover, assuming the weather cooperated. It was more than enough force to reach Bastogne under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Germans knew the Americans would try to relieve Bastogne and had positioned forces to contest every mile of the approach. December 23rd, 0600 hours. The attack began in a snowstorm. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command B jumped off from positions south of Bastogne driving north toward the villages that controlled the approach roads. They made good progress initially. 3 miles by noon, German resistance scattered and disorganized. Patton's optimism seemed justified. Then Combat Command B hit prepared German defenses at the village of Bougainville, and the advance stopped dead. Bougainville sat astride the main approach road, a cluster of stone buildings defended by elements of the 5th Parachute Division. German paratroopers, elite troops with combat experience from Russia and Normandy, had fortified the village with anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and pre-ranged artillery. American tanks trying to push through found themselves channeled onto a single road where German guns waited in ambush. The first 3 Shermans were destroyed within minutes. Armored infantry, trying to flank through fields, ran into mines and machine gun fire. What should have been a quick reduction of a small village turned into an all-day battle. By evening December 23rd, Combat Command B had taken Bougainville, but at terrible cost. 15 tanks destroyed, 300 casualties, including the battalion commander, killed by sniper fire. They'd advanced 3 more miles, 6 miles total in 1 day. At that rate, reaching Bastogne would take another week. Patton, receiving the reports, exploded with characteristic profanity-laced fury. His subordinates tried to explain the difficulties, prepared defenses, determined resistance, terrain favoring defenders. He wanted results. He ordered 4th Armored to attack continuously, day and night, no pause for rest or consolidation. December 24th and 25th saw similar grinding combat. 4th Armored pushed north through villages with names American soldiers couldn't pronounce: Remofoss, Clochemont, Hompre. Each village required a separate battle. Each battle cost tanks and men. The Germans were contesting every crossroads, every farm, every piece of terrain that channeled American armor onto predictable routes. They'd had days to prepare these defenses while the American offensive was being organized. Now they extracted full value from that preparation. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, part of 4th Armored Spearhead. Abrams was a tanker's tanker, aggressive, tactically skilled, willing to lead from the front. His battalion had fought across France in the summer, earning a reputation for getting things done regardless of opposition. But the approach to Bastogne was different from France. The Germans weren't retreating. They were dug in and fighting for every yard. Abrams's battalion lost 6 tanks on Christmas Day alone, knocked out by German anti-tank guns that fired from concealment and displaced before American forces could respond. The 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, attacking on the flanks, made even slower progress. Infantry advancing through snow without armor support faced German positions that had to be reduced through firepower and close assault. Casualties mounted, company after company reduced to half strength, battalions losing commanders, medics overwhelmed by wounded who needed evacuation through snow-clogged roads. The fighting was reminiscent of World War I, static positions, frontal assaults, high casualties for minimal gains. December 26. Morning. 4th Armored Division was 5 miles from Bastogne. 5 miles that looked impossibly far, given the resistance encountered in every previous mile. Patton visited the division command post, demanding explanations for the slow advance. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding 4th Armored, explained what his commanders were seeing: determined German resistance, excellent defensive positions, weather limiting air support, roads clogged with supply vehicles, communications difficult in fluid combat. Patton listened, then delivered his assessment: get to Bastogne today, or I'll find someone who will. The order went down the chain of command with increasing urgency. 4th Armored would attack immediately with all available forces, driving directly for Bastogne regardless of flanks, regardless of casualties, regardless of anything except reaching the beleaguered garrison. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams was given the mission: take Combat Command Reserve, 53 tanks, 750 infantry, and punch through to Bastogne by nightfall. It was the kind of mission that looked simple on maps and suicidal to men who had to execute it. The final approach to Bastogne ran through the village of Assenois, 3 miles south of the American perimeter. German forces had fortified Assenois heavily, recognizing it as the critical choke point for any relief attempt. Anti-tank guns covered every approach. Infantry held positions in buildings and tree lines. Artillery was pre-plotted on the roads. Taking Assenois would require either a careful, methodical reduction that might take days, or a reckless direct assault that would cost heavily but might succeed through shock and speed. Abrams chose speed. December 26, 14:30 hours. Abrams briefed his company commanders on the plan. It wasn't complex because complex plans fell apart under fire. They'd drive straight through Assenois, ignore resistance on the flanks, shoot anything that got in the way, and keep moving until they reached Bastogne's perimeter. Infantry would ride on the tanks, dangerous but faster than moving on foot. Artillery would fire continuously on Assenois during the approach, suppressing but not eliminating German defenders. Speed was survival. Stop and you died. Keep moving and you might make it. The assault began at 15:45. 53 Shermans advanced in column, engines roaring, infantry clinging to every available surface. They hit Assenois at full speed, machine guns firing continuously, main guns engaging any target that appeared. German anti-tank fire erupted from multiple positions. The lead tank was hit and disabled. The second tank pushed past, crushing the wreckage aside. Another Sherman took a hit in the turret, crew bailing out as flames consumed the interior. The column kept moving, leaving burning vehicles in its wake, accepting losses as the cost of momentum. Lieutenant Charles Boggess commanded the lead surviving tank. He'd pushed through Assenois' northern edge, German fire impacting all around his Sherman infantry on his tank, firing at German positions as they passed. Ahead was open ground, and somewhere beyond that, Bastogne. Boggess ordered his driver to gun the engine. They raced across 3 miles of snow-covered fields, 2 other Shermans following, expecting German fire from any direction. At 16:50 hours, they reached the American perimeter near a position held by the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion. Boggess's Sherman stopped. He climbed out of the turret, wary of trigger-happy defenders who might shoot, before identifying friendly forces. American soldiers emerged from their positions cautiously, weapons ready. There was a moment of mutual suspicion. Both sides had heard of German forces using captured American vehicles. Then recognition, identification, confirmation. The first elements of 4th Armored Division had reached Bastogne. The corridor was open, barely. Just 3 tanks and a few dozen infantry who'd survived the run through Assenois, but it was open. The cost of Patton's relief operation was staggering. 3rd Army casualties from December 22nd through December 26th exceeded 5,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. 4th Armored Division alone lost 1,400 casualties, nearly a battalion's worth of men. 50-plus tanks destroyed or disabled. Countless vehicles damaged. For perspective, the casualties suffered relieving Bastogne nearly equaled the casualties suffered by the garrison defending it. The relief wasn't a cavalry charge, it was a meat grinder that happened to end at Bastogne's perimeter. The corridor 4th Armoured opened was tenuous. A single road, barely 250 yards wide, German positions close enough on both sides that they could observe traffic and call in artillery. Resupply convoys moving through the corridor came under fire. Wounded being evacuated south took casualties during evacuation. The relief had been achieved tactically, but Bastogne remained isolated practically. Widening and securing the corridor would require days more fighting. Patton's promise to reach Bastogne by Christmas had failed by one day, December 26th, instead of December 25th. But given the resistance encountered and the conditions under which Third Army operated, reaching Bastogne at all qualified as an achievement. The operation demonstrated what American forces could accomplish through aggressive action and acceptance of casualties. It also demonstrated the cost of such operations. Speed and violence weren't free. They were purchased with the lives of men who drove toward Bastogne, knowing the odds favored death, but accepting those odds as the price of mission success. Private First Class John Klein, wounded during the assault on Asenwai, wrote from a field hospital, "We paid for every yard of ground between our start line and Bastogne. Paid in blood and burning tanks, and boys who'll never go home. Was it worth it? Ask the guys in Bastogne who we pulled out. They'll tell you it was worth it. Ask the families of guys who died getting there. They might tell you different. Me, I don't know. I just know we were told to go and we went, and somehow some of us made it through." His words captured the ambiguity of military success purchased at human cost, necessary perhaps, but never without consequences that would echo long after the tactical situation was resolved. December 26th, German Army Group B headquarters, somewhere in the Eifel Forest. Field Marshal Walther Model read the situation reports with growing dismay. 2nd Panzer Division, the spearhead unit that had penetrated farthest west, was surrounded near Cellars, its fuel exhausted, under attack by British and American forces. 5th Panzer Army's advance had stalled 15 miles short of the Meuse River. 6th Panzer Army, which had failed to break through in the north, was bogged down fighting for road junctions it should have captured on day one, and Bastogne, that insignificant Belgian town that should have fallen in hours, remained in American hands despite 8 days of siege. The reports arriving at German headquarters painted a picture of cascading failure. Fuel consumption had exceeded even pessimistic projections. The offensive had burned through Germany's carefully hoarded petroleum reserves, at rates that made sustained operations impossible. Panzer divisions that should have been racing toward Antwerp were stationary, their tanks serving as stationary artillery because there wasn't enough fuel to move them. The plan had always depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps during the advance, but the rapid American collapse that would have made those captures possible had never materialized. December 26, 0900 hours. Model received confirmation that 2nd Panzer Division was being destroyed near Celles. British armour and American forces had trapped the division in a pocket with no fuel for withdrawal and limited ammunition for defence. Over 80 tanks would be lost, 2,000 men killed or captured. It was Germany's farthest penetration of the offensive within 5 miles of the Meuse River, and it ended not in triumph but in annihilation. The irony was bitter. 2nd Panzer had come close enough to its objective to see the river, but not close enough to matter strategically. General Heinrich von Lipwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps around Bastogne, sent his own assessment to higher headquarters. His forces had suffered approximately 40% casualties attempting to reduce Bastogne. Artillery ammunition was critically low. Infantry replacements were not arriving. Most seriously, the American relief force from the south had broken through to Bastogne. The corridor was narrow and vulnerable, but it existed. Von Lüttwitz's recommendation was stark. Withdraw forces from Bastogne, establish blocking positions to the south, preserve combat power for defensive operations that were now inevitable. Model rejected the recommendation. Hitler's orders were explicit: continue offensive operations, reach the Meuse River, drive on to Antwerp. The fact that these orders bore no relationship to actual capabilities on the ground was irrelevant. German commanders in late 1944 had learned that suggesting impossibilities were impossible, risked removal, disgrace, or worse. So they nodded, acknowledged orders, and tried to accomplish what they knew couldn't be accomplished. It was command climate that guaranteed failure while punishing anyone who acknowledged it. December 27, morning. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, prepared withdrawal plans without calling them withdrawals. He ordered units to consolidate positions to establish defensive lines to preserve combat power. The language was euphemistic, but the intent was clear. The offensive was over. Defensive operations were beginning. Von Manteuffel was gambling that by the time higher headquarters recognized what he was doing, the situation would have deteriorated enough that his decisions would be seen as necessary rather than defeatist. The strategic failure of the Ardennes offensive was visible in multiple dimensions. Geographically, German forces had advanced at most 60 miles far short of the Meuse River, impossibly far from Antwerp. Temporarily, the offensive had consumed 2 weeks without achieving any strategic objectives. Militarily, Germany had committed its last reserves, 13 divisions that could have been used defensively, to an offensive that achieved nothing except casualties. Germany couldn't replace. The material losses were staggering: over 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned, 3,000 vehicles lost, artillery pieces by the hundreds captured or destroyed, when fuel shortages prevented their withdrawal. The human cost exceeded German capabilities to sustain 60,000 German casualties in 2 weeks, killed, wounded, or captured. These weren't just numbers. They were experienced infantry, trained tank crews, officers who understood combined arms operations, specialists whose skills took years to develop. Germany in December 1944 didn't have years. It had months maybe, before Allied armies reached the Rhine River and began the final conquest of German territory. Every casualty in the Ardennes was a soldier who wouldn't be available for defending the homeland. December 27, afternoon. Von Lüttwitz sent another message to Model's headquarters. American forces were expanding the corridor to Bastogne. German positions on both sides of the corridor were under sustained artillery fire and air attack. His divisions were combat ineffective, reduced to 30% strength, unable to conduct offensive operations. The message was another plea for permission to withdraw. Model's response came within the hour: hold current positions, prepare to renew offensive operations when reinforcements arrive. The reinforcements wouldn't arrive, they didn't exist, but the order stood. German soldiers around Bastogne, reading between the lines of orders that made no tactical sense, understood what was happening. The offensive had failed. They were being left in exposed positions because higher headquarters couldn't admit failure. Some units began conducting unauthorized withdrawals, pulling back at night to more defensible positions closer to German lines. Officers reported these movements as tactical adjustments rather than retreats. The gap between official reports and ground reality widened daily. The fuel crisis had become catastrophic across the entire front. Panzer divisions were reporting fuel levels below 10%, enough for a few miles of movement, not enough for sustained operations. Supply units couldn't bring fuel forward because the roads were clogged with traffic and under constant air attack. The Americans, recognizing German vulnerabilities, targeted fuel convoys with fighter bombers whenever weather permitted. German soldiers watched their fuel trucks burn and understood that without fuel, their armor was just elaborate stationary fortifications. December 28th, night. In command posts across the Ardennes, German officers prepared assessments they knew would be unwelcome at higher headquarters. The Ardennes offensive had failed in every measurable way. Strategic objectives unattained, Allied lines unbroken, German casualties unsustainable, material losses catastrophic. The only question remaining was whether Germany would conduct an orderly withdrawal to defensible positions or continue offensive operations until combat units were destroyed in place. Military logic favored withdrawal. Hitler's orders demanded continuation. German commanders were caught between logic and loyalty, knowing that choosing logic meant defying orders from the highest level. The psychological impact on German soldiers was perhaps the most damaging long-term consequence. They'd been told this offensive would change the war, would split the Allies, would force a negotiated peace. They'd believed it because they needed to believe something offered hope. Now, after 2 weeks of brutal combat, they could see the results: minimal gains, massive losses, and American forces counterattacking with growing strength. The realization that Germany was losing the war, truly irreversibly losing, spread through the ranks in whispers and silences, in the way men stopped talking about future plans and started talking about survival. Bastogne, specifically, represented a microcosm of the larger German failure. A single American division, surrounded and outnumbered, had tied down multiple German divisions for over a week. The time spent besieging Bastogne was time not spent advancing towards strategic objectives. The forces committed to Bastogne were forces unavailable elsewhere. The ammunition expended, the fuel burned, the casualties suffered, all in a futile attempt to capture a town whose symbolic value far exceeded its tactical importance. German commanders understood too late that Bastogne had been a trap, one they'd walked into willingly and couldn't escape. December 29th, early morning. Hitler finally authorized limited withdrawals in the northern sectors of the offensive. The authorization came with conditions and restrictions that made rational operations difficult, but it acknowledged implicitly what everyone already knew: the offensive was over. German forces would transition to defensive operations, trying to hold whatever ground they'd gained, preparing for the Allied counteroffensives that would inevitably come. The dream of reaching Antwerp, of splitting the Allied armies, of changing the war's trajectory, all of it dissolved into the reality of exhausted divisions conducting fighting withdrawals through winter conditions. For the German soldiers who'd fought around Bastogne, the sense of waste was palpable. They'd done everything asked of them. They'd attacked repeatedly against prepared defenses. They'd suffered terrible casualties. They'd persisted despite ammunition shortages and fuel exhaustion. And they'd accomplished nothing. Bastogne remained in American hands. The garrison they'd surrounded for 8 days had been relieved. The strategic situation was worse than when the offensive began, because now Germany had spent its reserves for no gain. Private Hans Schmidt, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, wrote in a diary recovered after his capture, "We were told we would win. We believed because we needed to believe. Now I see the truth. We cannot win. We can only die slowly instead of quickly. I do not know which is better. My friends are dead. My country is dying. What have we accomplished except to delay the inevitable? Bastogne cost us everything and gave us nothing." His words, written in pencil on scraps of paper, captured the demoralization that was spreading through German ranks as the reality of failure became undeniable. The collapse wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, a slow dissolution of offensive capability into defensive desperation. Units didn't break and run. They conducted orderly withdrawals, fighting rearguard actions, preserving what combat power remained. But the psychological shift was complete. German forces that had attacked with confidence in December were defending with grim fatalism by January. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed. And Bastogne, that town nobody had heard of until German paratroopers surrounded it, had played a crucial role in that failure by simply refusing to fall. December 26, 14:30 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in his tank turret, binoculars raised, studying the village of Assenois. Behind him, Combat Command Reserve assembled for the assault, 53 Sherman tanks, 750 armored infantry from C Company, 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion. Ahead, 3 miles of German-controlled territory ending at Bastogne's perimeter. The plan was simple because complexity died in combat. Drive straight through, shoot everything, don't stop until you reach friendly lines. Abrams lowered his binoculars. Time to find out if audacity could substitute for proper preparation. Assenois looked like dozens of other Belgian villages. Stone buildings clustered around a church, narrow streets, farmland on the approaches. But Assenois controlled the last defensible terrain before Bastogne. German forces knew any American relief effort would come through this village. They'd spent days preparing defenses. Anti-tank guns sighted to cover approach roads, machine gun positions in buildings. Infantry dug into positions around the village edges. Artillery pre-plotted on likely routes. Taking Assenois methodically would require careful reconnaissance, coordinated assault, probably 2 days minimum. Abrams didn't have 2 days. He had 3 hours of daylight and orders to reach Bastogne tonight. At 15:45 hours, American artillery began firing on Assenois. Not a preparation barrage designed to destroy German positions. There wasn't time or ammunition for that. Just suppressive fire to keep German heads down during the American approach. 155mm howitzers walked shells through the village. Explosions marching north to south, back to south to north, creating smoke and confusion. The barrage would continue during the assault, lifting only when American tanks entered the village. It was dangerous, risk of friendly fire casualties, but necessary to give the attackers any chance of surviving the approach. Lieutenant Charles Boggess commanded the lead tank of the assault column. His Sherman, nicknamed Cobra King, would be first into Assenois, first to draw German fire, first to die if the assault failed. Boggess was 22 years old, looked younger, had been in combat long enough to know that leading meant accepting risks that killed people. He checked his crew, gunner ready, loader ready, driver ready, then gave the order to move out. Behind him 52 more tanks started engines. Infantry climbed aboard, and Combat Command Reserve began its final approach to Bastogne. The column moved fast, engines at full throttle, tracks throwing snow and mud. Speed was their only protection. Moving targets were harder to hit than stationary ones, and stopping meant presenting German anti-tank guns with perfect targets. The tanks advanced in single file, each following the one ahead, machine guns firing continuously at anything that looked like a German position. Infantry riding on the tanks added their fire rifles, and BRs shooting at windows, tree lines, anywhere an enemy might be hiding. The noise was tremendous, overwhelming, the roar of engines and crack of gunfire, creating an acoustic wall that moved toward Assenois like a physical force. German anti-tank fire erupted at 800 yards. The first round missed, impacting in snow to the left of the column. The second round hit the third tank in line, penetrating the hull at the junction of front slope and side armor. The Sherman lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from hatches. The crew bailed out, running through snow while machine gun fire chased them. The column didn't stop. Abrams' orders had been explicit. Disabled tanks were to be bypassed. Crews would have to make their own way back. Mission was more important than individual vehicles. It was brutal calculus, necessary for breakthrough operations. Bogus's tank reached Bastogne at 16:15 hours, smashing through a roadblock at the village's southern edge. German infantry in buildings fired Panzerfausts, one-shot anti-tank weapons that could destroy a Sherman if they hit vulnerable points. Bogus's gunner fired high-explosive shells into buildings, collapsing walls, silencing weapons. The tank behind Bogus took a Panzerfaust hit in the turret, killing the tank commander and wounding the gunner. The Sherman kept moving, now commanded by the loader who'd climbed into the dead commander's position and was firing the 50 caliber machine gun at anything moving. The fight for a seigneur devolved into chaos. American tanks rolled through streets too narrow for proper maneuvering, firing at point-blank range at German positions. Infantry jumped off tanks to clear buildings, throwing grenades through windows, firing into doorways. German soldiers fought from cellars and attics, from positions that couldn't retreat and wouldn't surrender. The Americans didn't have time for systematic clearing. They killed anyone who resisted, bypassed anyone who didn't, and kept moving north. A seigneur would have to be fully secured by following units. The assault column's job was breakthrough, not consolidation. By 16:30 hours, the lead elements of Combat Command Reserve had broken through Assenway's northern edge. Behind them, the village burned. 20 American tanks were destroyed or disabled in the assault. Infantry casualties exceeded 150 men, but the column was through, accelerating across open ground toward Bastogne, German positions on both flanks firing but unable to stop the momentum. Artillery fire from both sides made the open ground a killing zone, shells impacting randomly, more danger from friendly fire than enemy at this point, as American and German artillery both tried to influence a fluid, fast-moving battle. Bogus's tank covered the final 3 miles to Bastogne in 15 minutes, driving at maximum speed, expecting ambush from any direction. 2 other Shermans followed close behind, their crews keeping pace through terrain that would normally be reconnoitered carefully before movement. But careful had been abandoned in favor of fast. The 3 tanks raced toward positions marked on Bogus's map as the American perimeter, hoping the map was accurate, hoping the defenses didn't shoot first and identify later. At 16:50 hours, Bogus saw American positions ahead, foxholes, dugouts, engineer positions that looked like they'd been occupied for days. He stopped his tank, climbed out carefully, hands visible, shouting identification. American soldiers emerged cautiously, weapons ready, years of combat making them suspicious of anything unexpected. There was a moment of mutual verification, Bogus showing dog tags, American engineers confirming he was who he claimed, both sides relaxing incrementally as relief replaced suspicion. Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion was the first defender to reach Bogus's tank. The meeting was anticlimactic in its ordinariness. No dramatic speeches, no emotional embraces, just tired soldiers confirming that relief had arrived. Webster asked if Bogus's force was the whole relief column. Bogus laughed bitterly and gestured at his 2 accompanying tanks. This was it, he said. 3 tanks, maybe 30 infantry still alive from the assault. The rest of Combat Command Reserve was strung out behind them, fighting through Bastogne or trying to widen the corridor. But 3 tanks had made it. The siege was broken technically, even if practically Bastogne remained isolated. The cost of the final mile was apparent in the wreckage left along the approach. 14 tanks destroyed between the start line and Bastogne. 150 casualties among infantry who'd ridden tanks into combat. 20 German vehicles destroyed, over 200 German casualties. Assenois devastated by the fighting. All this to achieve a breakthrough measured in yards of corridor width, tenuous and vulnerable, but sufficient to claim that relief had been accomplished. News of the breakthrough spread through Bastogne's perimeter within minutes. Soldiers who'd been defending for 8 days heard that Patton's tanks had arrived, that the siege was lifted, that they were no longer alone. The reaction was muted, not the jubilation that movies would later depict, but quiet satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. They'd held. The promise that relief was coming had been fulfilled, but nobody was celebrating because everyone knew the fighting wasn't over. The corridor was vulnerable. German forces surrounded them on 3 sides, and tomorrow there would be more combat. General McAuliffe arrived at the breakthrough point within the hour, driven from his headquarters in a jeep that took random artillery fire during the trip. He met with General Gaffey, commanding 4th Armored Division, who'd followed the assault column to Bastogne. The 2 generals conferred in a blasted farmhouse that had served as an engineer command post. Their discussion focused on immediate tactical necessities, widening the corridor, establishing secure supply routes, coordinating defensive sectors. There were no speeches about historic achievement, just professional soldiers solving tactical problems that would determine whether the breakthrough turned into genuine relief or just postponed inevitable catastrophe. Private First Class John Faig, 501st PIR, watched Bogus's tank arrive from his foxhole 500 yards away. He'd been fighting since December 19th, hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 8 days, was operating on instinct and muscle memory more than conscious thought. Seeing the American tank penetrate the perimeter felt unreal, like something that couldn't actually happen after days of expecting nothing except more Germans and more combat. Faig wrote later, "When that first Sherman rolled up, I didn't feel relief or happiness. I felt confused. We'd been alone so long that having help arrive didn't make sense. It was like your brain couldn't process that the nightmare might end." The final mile to Bastogne had been purchased with blood and burning tanks, with calculated risks that killed men who took them, with determination that bordered on recklessness. It was the kind of military operation that looked brilliant in retrospect and insane to people executing it in real time. But it worked. Barely, by margins measured in minutes and yards. Combat Command Reserve had broken through. The corridor existed. Bastogne was relieved. Everything else, widening the corridor, evacuating wounded, establishing secure logistics, would be tomorrow's problems. Tonight, 3 American tanks sat inside Bastogne's perimeter, proof that breakthrough operations could succeed even when logic suggested they were suicide. The final mile had been the hardest, always is. The miles before build momentum, create conditions, position forces. The final mile is where success or failure crystallizes, where plans meet reality, where courage and capability determine outcomes. From Assenois to Bastogne, 3 miles covered in violence and speed defined the difference between relief and abandonment. The soldiers who died covering those miles never knew if their deaths achieved anything. The soldiers who survived knew exactly what those deaths purchased survival for 18,000 men who'd held Bastogne against overwhelming odds and needed only to be reached before exhaustion or German assault broke them. 3 miles, 14 tanks, 150 casualties, one corridor, relief achieved. December 26, 1700 hours. The handshake between Lieutenant Charles Boggess and Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineers was firm but brief, two exhausted soldiers confirming facts rather than celebrating them. Behind Boggess, more tanks from Combat Command Reserve were filtering through Assenois, widening the corridor one vehicle at a time. Around them, the detritus of 8 days' siege lay scattered across frozen ground, abandoned equipment, shell craters, burned vehicles, temporary graves marked with helmets on rifles. The first supply convoy entered Bastogne at 1800 hours, 40 trucks carrying ammunition, food and medical supplies. The drivers had run a gauntlet of German fire through the corridor, several trucks damaged, 2 destroyed, but enough got through to matter. Artillery crews scrambled to unload shells, medical personnel grabbed plasma and morphine, infantrymen distributed K-rations and ammunition. The efficiency was remarkable. Soldiers who'd been rationing everything for days now moved supplies with practiced urgency, born of knowing how quickly circumstances could change. Wounded evacuation began simultaneously. 600 casualties had accumulated in Bastogne's aid stations. Men with wounds that required surgical facilities beyond what field medics could provide. They were loaded into ambulances and trucks for the dangerous journey south through the corridor. German artillery targeted the road intermittently, knowing that supply and evacuation traffic represented American vulnerability. Several ambulances were hit. Wounded men who'd survived combat died during evacuation. It was the kind of bitter irony that war produced routinely. The meeting between McAuliffe and Gaffey that evening focused on tactical realities rather than symbolic achievements. Yes, the corridor was open, but it was also vulnerable, only 250 yards wide at its narrowest point, dominated by German positions on both sides, subject to artillery fire and potential German counterattacks. Widening and securing the corridor would require days of additional combat. Until then, Bastogne remained effectively besieged, just with a tenuous lifeline rather than complete isolation. December 27, 0600 hours. Soldiers from the 101st Airborne and 4th Armored Division found themselves fighting side by side, defending the corridor against German attempts to close it. The interaction was interesting. Paratroopers, who'd held defensive positions for 8 days working with tankers who'd attacked continuously for 4 days. Different units, different combat experiences, but shared understanding that the corridor was everyone's lifeline now. Nobody wanted to return to full siege conditions. The relief had transformed the psychological landscape without immediately changing tactical circumstances. Defenders who'd faced potential annihilation now faced continued hard combat, but with knowledge that evacuation was possible, resupply was happening, reinforcement might arrive. It was the difference between fighting with your back against a wall and fighting as part of a larger force. The distinction mattered psychologically, even when it didn't change daily tactical operations significantly. Private First Class Donald Burgett, 506th Fire, described the moment of contact in his diary. "We've been relieved, they tell us. Doesn't feel much different. Still in foxholes, still getting shot at, still cold and hungry, but knowing there's a way out if things go bad, that changes something. Can't explain it exactly. Just feels like we have options now, where before we had none." Chaplain Sampson held services throughout December 27th, brief ceremonies at various positions around the perimeter. He spoke about survival and sacrifice, about men who died before relief arrived, about the responsibility of survivors to honor that sacrifice by living fully. Some soldiers listened with visible emotion. Others stared with the blank expression of men who'd processed too much death to feel anything immediately. The services weren't about comfort so much as acknowledgement, recognizing what had been endured, what had been lost, what remained. December 27 through January 9. The relief of Bastogne proved to be just the beginning of another battle. The fight to secure and widen the corridor that connected the garrison to friendly lines. German forces, recognizing they couldn't recapture Bastogne, focused on cutting the corridor and reimposing the siege. Daily attacks hit American positions on both sides of the narrow supply route. The fighting had the character of siege warfare reversed. Instead of trying to break out, American forces were trying to expand their access route. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division launched a major counterattack on December 27th, attempting to sever the corridor near Siberet. The assault was coordinated and determined, supported by armor and heavy artillery. American forces, elements of both 4th Armored and 101st Airborne, defended positions that were still being consolidated. The battle raged through the day, German tanks penetrating to within 500 yards of the main supply route before being stopped by concentrated American fire. Both sides suffered heavily, but the corridor held. January 3rd, the combined counteroffensive began. 101st Airborne attacked north from Bastogne, while 3rd Army divisions pushed south and east, attempting to eliminate the German salient and restore solid defensive lines. The 101st, which had spent 2 weeks defending, now transitioned to offense. The psychological adjustment was difficult. Soldiers trained to attack found themselves almost relieved to be moving forward rather than waiting in foxholes for the next assault. Casualties during this period exceeded those of the initial siege. December 27 through January 9 cost American forces approximately 2,500 killed and wounded. German casualties were higher, over 4,000 including prisoners, as German units, exhausted and low on supplies, began surrendering in small groups. The math of attrition favored the Americans now. They had supply lines, reinforcements, and air support. The Germans had none of those things. By January 9, the corridor had widened to 5 miles at its narrowest point. German pressure was relenting as the broader Battle of the Bulge collapsed, and German forces withdrew to defend approaches to the Rhine River. The 101st Airborne was pulled from the line for rest and refitting, replaced by the 17th Airborne Division. The relief was staged gradually, units rotated out sector by sector, maintaining defensive integrity while allowing exhausted soldiers to reach rear areas. The battle for the corridor generated less public attention than the initial siege, but it was equally important tactically. Without secure supply routes, Bastogne would have remained a liability rather than an asset. The fighting from late December through early January transformed Bastogne from besieged fortress into American strongpoint that anchored defensive lines and served as a launching point for future operations. January 1945, the 101st Airborne Division assembled in rear areas for the first time in a month. Medical personnel conducted systematic examinations, documenting the physical and psychological toll of Bastogne. The statistics painted a picture of sustained combat's costs in human terms. Casualties: 2,300 killed, wounded, or missing during the siege itself. Another 1,000 casualties during the subsequent corridor battles. 3,300 total combat losses from a division that began the siege with 11,000 men. Approximately 30% casualties, the threshold where military units typically lose combat effectiveness. The 101st had functioned through and beyond that threshold. Trench foot and frostbite cases exceeded 500. Many soldiers lost toes or parts of feet to cold injuries that would have been preventable with proper winter equipment and rotation from frontline positions. The cold weather casualties represented failures of logistics and planning that extended beyond any individual commander's responsibility. The American military in December 1944 simply wasn't prepared for winter combat in Northern Europe. Psychological casualties were harder to quantify. Post-battle assessments noted that approximately 40% of soldiers exhibited symptoms of combat stress, inability to sleep, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, difficulty concentrating. Modern medicine would call it post-traumatic stress. In 1945, it was just called combat fatigue, treated with rest and assumption that soldiers would recover sufficiently to return to combat. Some did. Others carried Bastogne with them for the rest of their lives. German casualties around Bastogne exceeded 15,000, killed, wounded, captured. Tank losses numbered in the hundreds. Artillery pieces destroyed or abandoned measured in dozens. The German formations that besieged Bastogne never fully recovered combat effectiveness. They'd been bled white in a siege that accomplished nothing strategically while consuming resources Germany couldn't afford to lose. Belgian civilian casualties. 250 documented deaths, though the actual number was probably higher. 2,000 buildings destroyed or heavily damaged in Bastogne proper. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, utilities, devastated by weeks of combat. The reconstruction of Bastogne would take years and serve as permanent reminder of December 1944. The question of whether Bastogne was worth the cost generated debate among military historians. Defenders argued that holding Bastogne disrupted German timetables fatally, forced commitment of German divisions that could have been used elsewhere, and demonstrated American resilience that had strategic effects beyond tactical results. Critics pointed to the casualties, the near-run nature of the defense, and argued that bypassing Bastogne might have allowed German forces to advance farther west before supply problems stopped them anyway. Medal of Honor citations. Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, decorations were distributed to recognize individual heroism and unit achievement. The entire 101st received a Presidential Unit citation, acknowledging collective excellence under impossible circumstances. But decorations couldn't resurrect the dead, couldn't restore shattered limbs, couldn't erase memories of friends dying in frozen foxholes. Survivors processed the experience in individual ways. Some embraced their veteran status, wore the division patch with fierce pride, attended reunions for decades afterward. Others never spoke of Bastogne, locked the memories away, tried to build lives separate from those 8 days in December. There was no single correct response to trauma. People healed differently or didn't heal, according to individual psychology and life circumstances. The legend began forming even before the fighting ended. War correspondents filed stories about the battered bastards of Bastogne, about McAuliffe's nuts response, about paratroopers who held against overwhelming odds. The stories were largely accurate in broad strokes, but simplified in ways that eliminated complexity and doubt. The actual experience, cold, fear, hunger, uncertainty, boredom punctuated by terror, got compressed into narratives of heroic defiance that served psychological and propaganda purposes better than unvarnished truth. 1945 through 2024. The story of Bastogne evolved across 8 decades, each generation adding layers of interpretation to events that occurred in December 1944. The transformation from historical event to cultural symbol reveals as much about how societies remember war as about the battle itself. Immediately after the war, Bastogne entered military doctrine. Staff officers studied the defense, analyzing what worked and what nearly failed. The lessons were incorporated into training: importance of air supply, value of defensive preparation, techniques for all-around defense, leadership under pressure. The 101st Defense became case study taught at command schools worldwide. Military professionals learned from Bastogne's success, while often overlooking how close that success came to failure. 1949, Bastogne Town Square. A memorial was unveiled honoring American liberators. Belgian gratitude was genuine and lasting. The town's destruction was acceptable cost for liberation from German occupation. Veterans who returned found themselves celebrated as heroes, their sacrifices acknowledged with ceremonies and dedications. The relationship between Bastogne residents and American veterans would remain strong for generations, annual commemorations bringing survivors back to the place where they'd fought and friends had died. The 1960s and 70s saw publication of numerous personal memoirs, soldiers writing their own accounts of the siege. The memoirs varied in quality and perspective, but collectively they revealed complexity absent from earlier official histories. Veterans described fear alongside courage, confusion alongside determination, moments of failure alongside success. The unvarnished accounts humanized the defenders, transforming them from icons into individuals who'd endured an experience that changed them fundamentally. The 2000th HBO series Band of Brothers brought Bastogne to mass audiences through dramatized portrayal of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The series was remarkably accurate by Hollywood standards based on extensive research and veteran interviews. But even accurate dramatization compressed and simplified 8 days of siege into 2 hours of television, hundreds of individual experiences into narrative, focusing on a single company. Veterans had mixed reactions. Some appreciated seeing their story told. Others felt the reality of cold, hunger, and prolonged stress couldn't be captured in entertainment format. 21st century analysis brought new perspectives. Historians examining German records developed fuller understanding of German decision-making and the strategic context. The picture that emerged was of an offensive that was logistically doomed from inception, with Bastogne serving as symptom rather than cause of German failure. This interpretation complicated earlier narratives that placed Bastogne at the center of Allied success. The defenders had accomplished something genuinely impressive, but German defeat resulted from multiple factors beyond any single tactical action. The final surviving veterans reached their 90s and began passing. Their deaths meant transition from living memory to documented history. The last personal witnesses, men who could say, "I was there," disappeared, leaving only their written and recorded accounts. Future generations would know Bastogne through these accounts, through photographs, through artifacts, but not through personal testimony. The shift from memory to history was inevitable, but poignant, marking final end of direct connection to events. Military analysts continued debating Bastogne's lessons. Could modern forces replicate the defense? Would contemporary logistics enable siege defense or make it impossible? How did airborne forces' unique characteristics, physical fitness, unit cohesion, aggressive mindset, contribute to success? The questions yielded insights about human factors in warfare that transcended specific historical circumstances. Bastogne demonstrated that motivation, leadership, and unit cohesion could compensate for material disadvantages, a lesson applicable across military contexts. The legend of Bastogne emphasized defiance, the surrounded garrison that refused to surrender, that held against overwhelming odds, that exemplified American determination. The truth was more complex and more human. Yes, they held. But holding was a near thing, sustained by luck as much as skill, by German failures as much as American successes. Soldiers who experienced Bastogne didn't feel particularly heroic. They felt cold, scared, and lucky to survive. The gap between legend and lived experience reflected fundamental differences between how societies remember war and how individuals experience it. Bastogne's legacy extended beyond military history into cultural consciousness. The siege became metaphor for resilience, for refusing to yield despite adversity, for the idea that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things under pressure. Politicians invoked Bastogne in speeches about national determination. Businesses used Bastogne analogies in motivational contexts. The battle transcended its original military meaning to become symbol with broader application. But what did the soldiers themselves think about their experience decades later? Interviews with aging veterans revealed complicated feelings. Pride in accomplishment, mixed with sadness about losses. Satisfaction at having done their duty, mixed with questions about whether different leadership might have avoided the crisis entirely. Appreciation for recognition mixed with discomfort at being treated as heroes when they'd just been doing what was required. The veterans' own assessment of Bastogne was more nuanced than public celebration suggested. The last question, was Bastogne worth the cost? Admits no definitive answer militarily. Holding Bastogne disrupted German operations and contributed to Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. But would German offensive have succeeded if Bastogne fell? Probably not. German logistics were inadequate regardless. Did American defense save lives by stopping Germans early, or did it cost lives that might have been preserved by strategic withdrawal? The counterfactuals are unknowable. What's certain is that approximately 6,000 Americans and 15,000 Germans became casualties at Bastogne. Families lost sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, communities lost young men who would never return. Those losses were real and permanent, unaffected by debates about strategic necessity. War's cost is always measured ultimately in human terms that transcend tactical analysis. December 24th, 2024. 80 years after the siege, visitors walk Bastogne's streets, tour the museum, stand at memorials dedicated to American defenders. The town has been rebuilt, prosperity restored, but memory remains. Young Belgian students learn about December 1944, about the Americans who fought and died for their town's liberation. The connection between present and past remains tangible in ways uncommon for 80-year-old events. Bastogne endures in memory because it represents something fundamental about human behavior under pressure: the capacity to endure, to resist, to maintain cohesion when circumstances favor dissolution. The defenders weren't superhuman. They were regular soldiers who found themselves in impossible situation and somehow persevered. That ordinariness makes their achievement more rather than less impressive. They were what any of us might be if tested similarly: scared, hungry, cold, but determined not to quit. The siege of Bastogne lasted 8 days. The memory has lasted 80 years and counting. The men who defended it are mostly gone now, passed into history along with the war they fought. What remains is story of courage and suffering, of ordinary men doing extraordinary things, of a small Belgian town that became symbol of American resilience. The story has been simplified and mythologized over decades, but the core truth endures: they were surrounded, outnumbered, and told to hold, and they held. Sometimes, in war and in life, that's enough.